participants to be seated. Kindly ensure that your mobile phones are on silent. We will begin very shortly.
My name is Trang, but then Thảo is the middle name. Yeah, because in the order of Vietnamese name, it should be written. No, like if you write in English way, then it should be like that. But like because our name in Vietnamese way is Nguyen Thảo Trang, something like that. Yeah, my name is Trang. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. What's your name again? Izati. Izati. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam, your MC for today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to day 2 for the Conference of Trade and Global Value Chains during times of insecurity, jointly hosted by the World Bank and the Asia School of Business. Today's program consists of 3 sessions themed around automation, shocks, and concentration, trends in investment, and sanctions, export controls, and dispute settlement. Without further ado, let us move on to the first session, automation, shocks, and concentration. In this session, we will have 3 presenters in the following order. Ms. Tao Chang Yun from Maastricht University, Sally Shin from BIS Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and Eduardo Pinheiro Fraga from the World Bank. Each presenter will have 25 minutes to present their topic and a further 15 minutes for open discussion. We request an uninterrupted 5-minute start to the presentation, after which participants are welcome to ask clarifying questions. For our YouTube participants, please post your questions on the chat box and we will get to your questions at an appropriate time. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite the first speaker, Ms. Tao Chang Yun, present her topic. Welcome to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Zhang, and I'm doing my PhD at UNU Merit United Nations University and also Maastricht University. So thank you so much for organizing this conference, and I hope that I can get some comments and also feedbacks from you that because this is an ongoing work, so it's really nice to have your feedbacks. So I want to start my presentation. The paper called "Does Automation Adoption Drive Reshoring? A Cross-Country Investigation." So we all know about the international fragmentation of production that happens during the 90s and also 2000s. However, the increasing fragmentation of production also impose some cost and also some risk here. That is the cost, for example, the loss of jobs from low-skilled workers in labor-intensive industry in developed countries to the offshoring workers in the offshoring countries. And also, for example, like the external shocks that are out of control for firms, that we all kind of talked about that for yesterday. So there's a kind of a debate and also a set of policies to bring jobs back home, which is called the reshoring. And then at the same time, there's the new introduction of new automation technology that may help to exacerbate this trend and bring disruption to the existing global value chains. And the argument for this one is that they said that like with the new automation technology that could substitute workers, low-skilled workers from that go to offshoring countries. So instead of like offshore those tasks to the offshoring countries, they can actually reshore to their home countries. So that's why they do not need to offshore to the tasks to the low-income countries. And also the introduction of new automation technologies could open up new opportunities for advanced countries to shift from like mass production to mass customized productions. For example, with the new technology like 3D printing or robot adoption, that can help the firms to actually change to the mass customized production. Okay, then what to expect in terms of the relationship between automation and reshoring? In the literature, there are two kinds of like set of literature that I can divide into. So the earlier ones that in the period of 2020s, then they said that like robot adoption can increase the reshoring. For example, in the case of Mexico country with the paper from Faber 2020, they said that robot adoption in the US actually hurt with the export from Mexico, from the exporting sector in Mexico, and also hurt the employees that employed in the exporting sector in Mexico. And there's also similar finding from Color and All in 2020 that they find in terms of US robot adoption also hurt Colombian workers. But the later literature actually find different findings compared to the last one. Now, for example, the recent research by Sun and Scheffler in 2022 actually find different findings. That is, AI actually increased bilateral trade or 3D printing technology adoption also increased the exports of hearing aids. And another interesting research is by Arthur and All in 2022 that they find that robot adoption in developed countries actually also promote trade. So that's why in this paper, my research question is that like how automation technologies affect the reshoring at the macro level. And in this research question, I want to have like the two sub-research questions. The first one is how to quantify the reshoring at the macro level. It means that at the country level and also at the country sector level. And I will also explain why this is important in the later part. The second part is like, does automation technologies increase reshoring at the macro level? In this, like, is this a linear relationship? Does it differ between high income, middle income, or lower middle income countries? It means that the income effects here. Is there different effect for different types of technologies, not only like robot or not only like 3D printing, but all kinds of automation technologies? Does this effect vary over time, and does this effect differ between manufacturing and services? However, in this presentation, I will not answer the last question, that does this effect differ between sectors, manufacturing and services, because I need to quantify in terms of automation adoption at the sector level, and it's still not ready yet. So for the last question, I haven't answered this one. Okay, for the contribution of this paper, I will contribute in terms of the new measure for offshoring and reshoring. So I propose a new measure to quantify reshoring at the macro level. So rather than like an implication of offshoring, I will measure directly the reshoring case. And I also describe reshoring as a flow process, which is different from other later papers and the previous papers. I take into account both intermediate inputs and final goods, consider both domestic and final demand, and include many tiers, not only tier one in the supply chain. The other contribution of this paper in terms of like the literature on automation and reshoring. In this, I study the effects of automation adoption on reshoring, and for preview of my finding, I find that like indeed the automation adoption reduce reshoring rather than like increase reshoring, which is opposite to the previous findings in terms of like they say robot adoption increase the reshoring. And I also focus on at the macro level, which is the country level, and I both focus on the scope of technology, which is innovation, and also the diffusion process, which is the adoption. So just to rationalize like why I find like the introduction of automation technology actually can reduce reshoring, I have the 4 channels that can actually explain this relationship. So the first one is the competition and market size channel that is already mentioned by Arthur and All in 2022. They find that with the market size channel, that is like producers in the developed countries that can substitute domestic workers for automation in automated tasks, And then that's why they can lower the cost of production in countries that adopt automation. Then that's why there's an increase in the demand of their product, and it leads to an increase in the imports. But at the same time, there's an opposing effect here, that is the competition channel. That's their lower cost of production in countries that adopt automation, and then their products more competitive, and that's why the producers can substitute foreign products to the domestic products. So that's why there are two opposing effects here, that like an increase in imports, but also a decrease in imports. So it depends on like which channel gonna be stronger, then the effect gonna be different. And indeed, in my finding, I find that like the market side channel is the one that drives this effect rather than the competition channel. And then there's the second channel is the productivity channel. There's a paper by Salo in 1985. They find that like new automation technology is everywhere. We see that like the introduction of ICT and the introduction of other new automation technologies, but it's different in terms of the statistics of productivity, that we don't see like we still see that the stagnant of productivity, especially in developed countries. So this is called the productivity paradox. However, like the recent research by Cabello and on 2022, they find that new technology do have a positive impact on productivity of the sectors of adoption. It means that if we go at the country level, we cannot really go like to explain like whether like the productivity effect actually happened. We need to go into the another level, that at the sector level, to see like whether this productivity effect that can actually happen with the sectors of adoption. And then because of the increase in the productivity, maybe also increase in the imports. The third channel is the sunk cost channel that is already mentioned by Andres in 2021, that I think already mentioned yesterday by Ziho with the offshoring that involves the sunk cost. And because of this sunk cost, so that's why firms will not abandon their activities in other countries because of the large sunk cost in the past. So it means that like it's just not like firms gonna adopt automation technologies and then suddenly they're gonna just reshore to their home country. That is the reshoring decision actually more of the complex decision. It involves many of the consideration in this. And then the last channel may be related to the characteristic and also the adoption rate channel for the automation technologies, that we think that like automation technology with all the large effects, then firms, people gonna adopt this technology. But in reality, we find that the adoption is actually only concentrated in few firms, for example, like large firms, and also in a few sectors and in a few countries. So that's why we expect that this kind of technology can have some kind of disruption. But in reality, with this, it's actually not what we expected. And also, there's another one that maybe also explained, that is the current robots are only a continuous version of previous automation technologies. So it doesn't have that kind of disruption effect that we expect in terms of the robot adoption. So in terms of the data, I use like the two main data. The first one is the Asian Development Bank's multi-regional input-output tables. The second one is the ADB Innovation and Structural Transformation Database. For the main variables, I have the three main variables that are important in my research. The first one is the reshoring, and then the second one is the automation adoption, and the third one is the automation innovation. So how I can actually measure the automation adoption? I use the imports of capital goods embedding automation technologies. And the reason that I use this measure, because there's a lack of systematic firm level information on adoption of automation and also AI technologies. So because the lack of the firm level information, so that's why there's also a lack in terms of the country level information in this. And with the country level information, we only have the information, for example, like robot adoption, which is from the International Federation of Robots. And in terms of when we talk about automation, industrial 4.0 is a lot of technologies, not only robot adoption. So that's why the measure of using imports of capital goods embedding automation technology is the one that most feasible in my case. I identified the other protocols that cover 6 types of subfields related to FOIA, the Industry 4.0, including CAD-CM, robots, automatic welding, 3D printing, regulating instruments, and ICT. The one with this, if we identify via the product codes, the problem is that it may cover the technologies that in Industry 3.0, because, for example, that you see with the ICT, and also, for example, with the new technology like Industry 4.0, like the AI one that is based on like cloud computing or machine learning, that is also based on ICT. So it's a little bit difficult to actually differentiate between these types of technologies. So, but majority of the technologies that I measure here is the 4IR technology. And the level of the measure is going to be at the country level. So that's why if I want to do at the sector level, I need to use some kind of like proxy and also assumption to get at the sector level. To measure automation innovation, I will use the patents of automation technologies. So we'll base on the PASTAT, and then this one is at the country level. So at the sector level, I will use the measure in the ADBI database as patent content or value added to get the number of patents at the sector level. And then go into the new measure of reshoring. So first of all, we need to be really clear in terms of the definition of reshoring. So reshoring is defined as the decision to relocate activities back to the home country by the definition of Fatochina in 2014. And the two things that we need to really clear in this is the first one that is relocate of the activities. So the relocate, it means that there's a flowing process here. It's not only a stop decision, but it's like there's a baseline and then there's a relocate on the relocating that's happening. And the second part is the home country. The home country, that's why in my measure, I can only measure in terms of the relocate to the home country rather than other concepts, for example, like nearshoring, farshoring, or friendshoring. These terms will not be covered in my measure. So my measure only covered with the reshoring one. So what are the concerns about the current measure? So the concerns about the current measure is that, first of all, with mostly the measure gonna focus on through the offshoring data. So they're gonna base on the imported intermediates. So that's why it would exclude any final goods that are assembled overseas. And also another measure gonna include both intermediate and final products to calculate what share of domestic demand is served by foreign products. But the thing with this measure is that it refers to only domestic demand and it excludes foreign demand in this. And also foreign input shares in value added decline may be due to a decline in production rather than talking about like the reshore of the relocate activities. And then with the firm level data, of course, the limitation is that it's only available for some countries and only available for a subset of firms and also a subset of years. So that's why I decided to measure reshoring at the macro level due to first, it can cover many indirect and direct relationships. It can reflect the reshoring process, including both intermediate inputs and final goods. It considers both domestic and foreign demand and examines the impact on the macro level. So the way that I measure that I adopt from present on 2021, however, in their method, they only cover the intermediate inputs in their measure and they only account for only direct relationship in supply chain. My measure is gonna be as reshoring at time t gonna be equal to domestic value added at time t over foreign value added at time t minus domestic value added at time t minus 1 over the foreign value added at time t minus 1. And in this, I also divide into the narrow reshoring and also broad reshoring. The narrow reshoring is only it means that like only domestic value added serve the domestic demand. For broad reshoring, I have that the domestic value added serve both domestic and also foreign demand. So the interpretation of this measure gonna be that like how much domestic value added increase relative to foreign value added compared to the previous year. And to calculate the domestic value added and also foreign value added.
Sorry, so this is both export and exports, right?
No, I am looking at the import one.
So this is domestic value added in your imports.
Foreign value added and domestic value added and foreign value added based on the import output table. So it means that it would include both of the import and export.
So this is domestic value added in both import and export.
Yeah. So I will have like how I calculate the domestic value added and the foreign value added here. Yeah, this is how I measure the domestic value added and the foreign value added.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so that is equal, that is the metric S equals to the metric V multiplied by metric L multiplied by metric F. So the V is the matrix of value added coefficient where elements VI equal to VAI over YI. This is the matrix of the input output table. Then we have the L is the relative matrix. We have the F is the diagonal matrix of the final demands. And in this, the natural measure is focused on the column side of the matrix S, and the broad measure is the domestic value added is sum of that country sector row. So with this matrix, is the measure this also actually kind of mentioned in the paper by Wang and All in 2017. However, in their measure for this metric S is actually to measure the import and also the export, the value added in terms of global value chains, which is their measure more focus on the stock one rather than the flow process. That is what is different in terms of my measure for reshoring one. So I will move to the sample and some facts about the data. This is the sample of the data. So in terms of this, I think the main thing that we need to get from this sample is in terms of the reshoring and also the automation adoption variable. So for the standard deviation that we can see in terms of the reshoring one, so the standard deviation between the between and the within here, you see that like the within standard deviation is actually greater than the between standard deviation. It means that like the reshoring variable actually more fluctuate within country rather than between countries. And then with the automation adoption variable, which is my independent variable, I have this between standard deviation is 1.56, but then the within deviation is 0.21. It means that they are driven by the between components rather than within components. So that's why if I include the fixed effect in my regression model, I will exclude, if I include the fixed effect, then I will exclude the between countries components here. So that's why I will, in terms of the regression model, I will use both of the random effect, also the fixed effect, and also the Hausman-Taylor to actually account for both of the between effect and also the within effect. This is like the facts from the data. So reshoring actually fluctuates over time from 2008 to 2019. Doesn't show that much of like it shows different pattern than the measure from Cranes and All in 2021. So this is from the measure of Cranes and All in 2021, and the fact that like the reshoring actually increased in the way that like very clear. But in my measure actually is different. Reshoring actually fluctuate here with this. This is China, this is Spain, this is UK, and this is the US. So it actually like fluctuate around the 0 level. Here it doesn't really show really clear that is like something of reshoring is actually happening. And then this is in terms of other countries, for example, like Germany, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and China or US and Vietnam. It also shows like not really clear in terms of the increasing of reshoring. And also at the sector level, it also have like different magnitudes over time and across sector for the new reshoring index. I will just skip the automation adoption figures, but go into the strategy and then go into the result. So at the cross-country level, I have like the reshoring variable and then the automation adoption, the number of patents for the innovation, the labor productivity, and other control variables. And I also have the sector country level, but this one we can skip because I haven't got the result for the sector country level to present it in the presentation. But for the result at the baseline result, so I have that those automation adoption increase reshoring at the macro level. I have the random effect, the fixed effect coefficient, and the Hausman-Taylor one. And then to see that at the random effect, we do not really see the significant level. We do not really see the effect between automation and reshoring, but with the fixed effect and the Hausman-Taylor, we both see that like automation adoption actually reduce reshoring rather than increase of the reshoring. And with the star here for the automation adoption and also the labor productivity, it means that it is treated as the endogenous variable in terms of the Hausman-Taylor regression. And then the second question maybe is that the linear relationship. That's why I will add the interaction effect. The first interaction effect is with the automation and the dummy of the automation with equal 1 if the automation adoption is greater than the median level of the median level of the automation adoption. And I find that like the interaction actually shows that like there's a meaningful coefficient for the interaction between automation adoption and the dummy variable. And then the second interaction may be related to the automation adoption with the automation innovation, because there's a thing that like there's an argument that co-location between production and innovation can improve the productivity, improve the innovation. So maybe there's a reason. That's also a reason that's why firms want to reshore to their home country, because they want the production and the innovation at the same place. So I get the interaction between automation adoption and also the innovation. However, I do not find the meaningful effect between this interaction. And again, with the I also do with the labor productivity, and the argument with the interaction between labor productivity and also automation adoption may be related to the upgrading concept. That the upgrading concept here more related to the lower income country. But again, I do not find like the meaningful effect between like automation adoption and labor productivity. I will skip like the figure for this. And then for the income effect, I also find that like the effect differ between high income, middle income, and lower middle income country. In that, the effect actually is driven by high income countries rather than the middle income and lower middle income countries. And at the region level, this is a little bit hard to see because this variable is a little bit different in terms of other variable here. But in terms of regression result, I have that like only the East Asia and Pacific and Europe and Central Asia actually are the two regions derived for the effect with automation adoption and reshoring in my case. And if this two regions are the one that driven, maybe the regional effect or the regional connectivity also one of the things that's very important in terms of driving this, the importance of regional connectivity. And then for the type of technology, I only find the meaningful effect of 3D printing and also ICT, which is a little bit surprising that I don't see the effect of robot adoption in my case. And then does the effect vary over time? Yes, I only find the meaningful effect for the period 2008 to 2013. So to sum up just the presentation, I want to just emphasize that reshoring is not a common trend in the period 2008 to 2019. I look at the impact of automation. So automation adoption is not associated by an increase in reshoring, but even promote offshoring. The marginal effect of automation adoption reducing reshoring is greater for countries that adopt more automation technologies. This effect is driven by high-income countries. Europe and Central Asia and East Asia and Pacific are the two regions driving this effect that confirm the importance of regional connection. And ICT and 3D printing are the two only technologies confirming this effect. And I find no effect for the period 2014 to 2019. Yeah. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you so much. And I hope to receive your feedbacks or comments or questions.
Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor to questions or comments.
One quick observation. You look around some examples of reshoring. You see the company Apple that brought back Mac Pro book from China to United States because of automation. And if you look at General Electric, they brought back the production of airplane engines back home because of that also automation. So my question is whether or not the type of automation makes a difference in different industries, so that it cannot generalize the impact across the board. That is, I think, something that we need to look into.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think that's very interesting because like in the channel that to explain the relationship between automation adoption and also reshoring, I also emphasize in terms of the sector level. So at the sector level, there is part that like productivity actually like productivity with the adoption of automation actually only happen for some sectors that adopt these technologies. But then like for other sector, because of the spillover effect, they cannot really have like the spillover effect to go into other sectors of automation if the other sectors do not adopt automation technologies. So that's why with the sector level, I think it's very important to dig more into that. And I already have like some kinds of strategy to actually go into the sector level to see really what's happening with the result.
Would it be advisable to do this type of work at the company level?
At the firm level.
At the firm level.
Yeah, actually, there's already some kind of research that they look at the firm level data. But the thing with the firm level data is that you can also do it with the survey result, or you can also do with the firm level data based on the custom data. So the transaction to say, okay, because there's an increase in the imports or there's a reduce in the imports, and then you say that it's reshoring. But in my case, I argue that like firm level data with the survey, we cannot really say that like in generally at the global level, at the country level, this is kept happening and have an effect. And also in terms of with the transaction data, for example, that can cover the universe of firms for one country, for example, then this kind of data to refer to imply for the reshoring actually is a little bit of it is a little bit of it's a little bit difficult to actually from that to say that like it reduce of imports then imply of the reshoring.
This is Fabian Vera, right here in front of you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Very fascinating display of research. Now, the question that I want to ask, it has two layers. The first one, which will be the limitations of one of your recommendations that says about confirming the importance of regional connection? That will be the first part. And now the second is, you mentioned at the beginning that this is an ongoing research. So where this is going? We talked about sectors, but I would like to hear from you, what else is on the oven?
Okay, for the first one, the first question in terms of regional connection here, that is thinking about like actually if regional, like we see the effect that actually driving up automation adoption increase the like reduce the reshoring that only happen for the Europe and Central Asia and East Asia and Pacific. It means that at the regional level, they are more connected. They are more connected, they are more dependent to each other. So that's why even with the automation adoption, they're gonna increase the offshoring or reduce the reshoring in this case. That's what I mean in terms of regional connectivity. That's the first question. For the second question, that is that the ongoing, that is like what I want to do is to see at the sector level to see can I really explain at the country level that is something that's happening, but maybe at the sector level I can see what kind of sector that is driving this effect, and maybe there's a difference in terms of the manufacturing and also the service industry, which is the adoption rate of the automation technology gonna be different. So that's why it's gonna maybe open up some kind of new things for at the sector level, and to see if there's some kind of relocation or the spillover effects between different sectors in this way. So that's what I wanted to do more in the future for this one.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. This may be out of the scope of these studies, but I just want to know throughout your study or literature review, is there any like mediating or moderating effect of subsidies or industrial policies by the countries to encourage reshoring activities? Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, in terms of like the research that, so your question is the research that talking about in terms of policy that promote of the reshoring? Yeah, because my research is mostly focused on the automation adoption. So I focus more in terms of like how the literature of automation adoption and reshoring rather than like other causes of reshoring, because the reshoring, of course, is a lot of like it's a complex decision. So there's a lot of factors that going on here. For example, in the beginning, we say that like because of the external shocks of the global external shocks that firms cannot really control. So maybe for that firms can that reason firms also can reshore to their home countries, or maybe because of the trade war or something, then they also reshore to their home country. That's a lot of reasons that going on for that, but I didn't like really follow with that kind of like literature, so I don't know much about the trade policy and also the reshoring, but I can look up into that for you if you're interested.
Okay, so thank you very much. We can move on to our next presenter.
Thank you so much.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. I have to say, I want to say thank you for the question for the previous panel, because it tees up to what I hope to discuss very nicely. Before I start, I want to just say that because of my employer, I just want to do the usual disclaimer. Please don't blame IMF, BIS, or the Hong Kong Monetary Authority for what I'm about to say. Okay. So yesterday's session, I thought we learned quite a few things. And the question that we just got now is really hones in on the need to really look at granular data, firm level data. So when we look at macro trends, are we missing something? Are we missing the nuance of what drives global value chain, shifts in global value chain? So the question we're asking actually really born out of this desire to really better understand what's going on. And it's actually born out of the intersection of geopolitics, what's happening right now, COVID, trade tension, and where we are. So where we are specifically in Hong Kong, at the intersection between, say, East and West, financial cycle, and business cycle. So there are actually two questions we're looking to answer. One is we just really want to get a sense for the lay of the land. But what are we looking at? What is the state of GVC? Are we seeing any realignment? Are we seeing any shifts as a result of changes we've seen in recent years? And that one change we're anchoring our analysis on is on COVID. So that's the first question. And the second question is, given what we see, does participation in GVC amplify risks? And does that depend on, say, what sector you're in? Does the role of crisis, the nature of crisis, affect risk amplification? So there are two questions here. The first question really is network map. What do? We tried a few things, actually, to be honest. What we settle on is this data set from S&P. It's a capital IQ data set. And I think many of you know this. This is a firm level data that essentially provides balance sheet information. But what's really useful and interesting for us is that in this balance sheet set, in this data set of balance sheet variables, there are also self-declared supplier customer relationships from this data set. So this is a data set that actually reported by firms. It indicates a bilateral supplier-customer relationship over the past 2 years. So we're able to pick up if there's such a linkage from this data set. It is a cross-section data set in the sense that it will indicate whether there's an existing relationship or not. But there are caveats. Because it is a self-declared set of relationships, we're not sure, and I think this is one of the feedback we had earlier, whether this data set is complete. We don't know if we're capturing the entire global sample of suppliers and customers. That's one. Two is, as you know, because this is S&P data set, the SEC does not require you to report these relationships unless your customer represents more than 10% of your revenue. So that's the drawback. I want to lay that out very clearly. And second drawback is that it's a binary set of variables. You have relationship or not. We don't know the intensive margin of these relationships. So that's what we start out. But it's still useful. What we did was that we dug into this data set and we cross-checked the relationships as suggested, as indicated in this data set with a set of official data from the US. These are shipping manifests, bill of lading data from the US Census Bureau. It essentially captures shipments, maritime shipments from anywhere in the world into the US. So that provides essentially indicators of extensive margin. Either I have a supplier from, say, Vietnam into the US, there is a customer-supplier relationship or not. So we cross-check that data set with what we use in Capital IQ. We're able to verify actually 80% of those relationships. And I'll go into a bit more detail later on the shipping manifest data set, because the beauty of this is that it also gives us intensive margin. Not only can we see relationships, customer-supplier relationships, but we can also gauge how much have you shipped per supplier, per shipment. That's the data. What else do we do? We purposely chose locational indicators. What does that mean? In S&P and in all the data set, you can gauge, you know the ultimate parent company is. But we actually are not interested in that. We're interested in locational data because we want to see how does risk amplify across different locales because of these GVC linkages. And we want to get a sense for where the location of different production networks are. Do you see shift from, say, China to the rest of Asia? Do you see, to address one of the questions earlier, do you see movement from Asia to Europe, to the Americas? So we want to anchor this on locational statistics. All right, what do we see? Before I even show you the maps, there are a few takeaways, and I'll show you the maps. One thing I think that's quite striking, actually, let's just bring this up, is that there is sizable decline in linkages. So how do you read this? There are nodes, these are circles, and there are edges, basically lines. Nodes are firms. So here, firms are customers. And the lines are directed customer to supplier relationships. And you notice that for simplicity, we basically just aggregated our data into 3 countries' regions. You have the blue, US firms, green, European firms, and Asia Pacific, basically this brownish yellow. And the denser the network means the more interconnections, the more complex the network. And the sparse the network means fewer interconnections, less complicated. So here, immediately, a few things jump out. First, I would say, compared to the beginning of the pandemic, this is February 2020, at the end of, quote unquote, end of pandemic, 2 years, you see the network become a lot less dense. It's patchier. that suggests to us that there's a sizable decline in inter-firm interconnections. In fact, when we calculate the number of interconnections at the end of 2021, the number of connections fell by 30% compared to February 2020. We updated this actually before I came here for using the March 2023 data. And guess what? Compared to December 2021, the number of interconnections in March rose by 3%. 3%. So what that tells us is that as a result of COVID or other reasons, we're not laying out causations here. We're just saying that over these 2-year episodes, GVC networks suffered sizable decline, and they were slow to recover. Even after 2 years, they did not recover. That's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is that if you look at the main nodes, the nodes with greater centrality, these, February 2020 compared to December 2021, you will see that the central nodes remain more or less the same. They kind of stay there. They haven't really moved. But I want to say I want to leave with you, if you need to leave now, a third takeaway, which is that there's tremendous heterogeneity across different sectors. So let's take a look. Oh, did I just go?
Sorry, before you go there, can I ask a question?
Yep.
Super interesting. So here are all nodes, not just the international, for instance.
Yep. That's right.
So all connections.
That's
Okay, you
right.
could do that also for just international connection would be also very interesting.
That's right.
Just avoiding the domestic.
Cross-border.
Yeah, just
exactly.
the cross-border one. Yeah.
Absolutely, we absolutely could do that. But what we did here is global. So it's not just, so it's actually everything. It's within a country, within region, and cross-border international.
Sorry, another question. So do you weight it somehow?
No.
So is it beyond something we would expect given the economic activity?
So you mean weight in what sense? Is it
Nodes.
intensive margin? Is the size of exposure?
So is this about a point about connections relative to the economic activity that's
No.
gone down?
There's no intensive margin here for this data set. That's the drawback.
No, that's fine. But even then, you can look at the interconnectedness of firms, to even the linkages, the number of them, whether how that fares relative to economic activity. What I'm saying is,
Yeah.
is it something that that's particular about COVID that's causing this, or is it we expect this to happen when global economy is recovering from large shock?
I will get to that. You will see that later on in one of the slides. But so one thing you can see is, the central nodes, right, are the major economies. So let me get to the subsector. Just hammer in the point that there is sizable heterogeneity across sectors that we have to go granular. So we looked at auto sector. So let's look at the map. This is interesting, right? Again, you can see that at the end of the 2 years, it's less dense. But a few things jump out. You can see that really European firms and American firms are central to the network. And then guess what? Asian firms, and there's Japan, you probably can't see. And of course, here you probably can't see. Here's a cluster of Japanese firms. And here's a cluster of Japanese firms right there. So what jumps out with this network is that there's sizable regionalization and national network in this network. And there are, in fact, sub-networks nested in this global GVC. So ex ante, we would say, all right, that means that perhaps the auto network is more insulated against these kind of shocks at a global level because you are able to get what you need on a regional level. And this is, by the way, in fact, aligned with literature, because the nature of the parts that are needed for auto production, they are heavy, they're bulky, shipment's not always easy. We've seen that actually there's tremendous sizable regionalization in auto production. And you see that in, say, Ford plants in China, where all the parts are practically the vast majority of everything Ford needs for their China production is actually in China and in Europe as well. So that's one network. What about another network that's very much in the news? IT. IT, by the way, the GIC sector includes communication equipment, chips, computer boards. Anyway, so let's look at that network. Very different from the auto network, isn't it? It is, in our mind, a truly global network in the sense that you see far more interconnection of firms and suppliers from different regions. So you see a US firm linked to suppliers in Asia, in the Americas, and in Japan, in Korea. You see here, I'm not sure you can pick out, this is a South Korean firm. You can guess what that one is. Linked to American suppliers, Asian suppliers, Japanese suppliers. This is a truly global network and is far more dispersed than auto. And again, ex ante, we would say that shocks to a central player will have repercussions that could percolate beyond the first layer into outer layers. That this is something that's a little harder to recover from if you have shocks. I will stop there without making any further comments about what the state of play between US and China at this point. But the interesting thing here is, again, looking at this ex ante, we'll say, well, COVID, if you have a supply shock as a result of events such as COVID, perhaps you could see bigger rent to be bigger damage done to firms linked in the IT network. We'll find out about that. And lastly, just quickly for reference, textile. Simple, no major players, no central players. You can argue that this is something that could be easily replaced. Okay. All right, so really takeaway from the first question is that there's sizable heterogeneity across different sectors, and that we do need to look at, when we think about GVC realignment, we really do have to go granular. Because here, looking at it on a sectoral level allows you to assess both intensive and extensive margin and how they contribute to GVC realignment. So that's the first question. Second question, we want to see, given the state of interconnections, does your role of firms' participation in GVC help amplify risks to those firms that are linked to that firm? So the way we go about doing this is a simple event study. We chose 2 events, both early in the pandemic. The first event is in late January 2020 in China. This was the Wuhan lockdown. And later on, the extension of the National Chinese New Year holiday into essentially mobility, broad spread mobility restrictions in China. So that's the first event. And the second event we chose was in Germany in mid-March, when the German border closed in response to COVID. And we chose these 2 events because we want to have exogenous shocks to the GVC network before the idea that there's going to be broad-based supply disruptions, before the realization that this was going to be not just 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but actually almost 3 years. That there's going to be this long-term, perhaps, damage to the global supply network. So we chose those 2 events. And what we did was that we then leveraged the data set from Capital IQ. We chose a subset of that data set. We use only publicly listed firms, and I'll explain why we did that. And what we did was that we exclude the firms that are headquartered, that had national headquarters in Germany and in China, because we want to see how lockdown announcements in China early in January and in Germany in mid-March affect firms that are linked to those that are located in China and in Germany. So clean identification of basically shocks and the impact. And the event window is 1 day, what happened, and then we extend that out to 5 days, to 10 days, to 15 days. And for robustness check, I can talk about that later. So basically, here's the equation. What are we looking at? On the left-hand side, we are looking at the daily change in the equity share price of the firms we studied. So this is why we're looking at publicly listed firms. On the right-hand side, there are a few variables we're interested in. One is this dummy variable lockdown. Takes the value of 1 if there's lockdown in China or in Germany, 0 otherwise. Second variable is GVC. This is a dummy variable that identifies the customer-supplier relationship. If you have a customer in China or a supplier in Germany, that's a 1. You're not, 0. And we control for market return. This is the benchmark return, benchmark indices for these various countries. And their return, essentially, we want to account for the fact that there's typical co-movement between these benchmark indices and the share prices. But really, the variable of interest is this interaction term. We want to see if there's any difference in share price performance of firms that are linked to China and Germany versus those that are not linked. So that's what we're interested in. And then we, of course, control for firm fixed effect and time fixed effect. So what do we see? This is a regression result. So we graphed it for ease of reading, but in our paper, you can see the longer exposition of how we do this. So the first takeaway is if you look at this left-hand panel, you can see that in general, firms that are linked to China and to Germany suffer bigger price declines compared to their counterparts that are not linked to China and Germany. So for China, it's about 0.4 percentage points. For Germany, it's a little bit over 0.8 percentage points. And the question is, well, why bigger impact on German-linked firms compared to Chinese-linked firms? And our conjecture at this point is that we think that by March, the idea that this is going to be something that's broad-based, that's not isolated to China, the idea that this could be something that's quite damaging for the global economy took hold. And in fact, if you recall, in March, that's when the major equity indices suffered sizable declines. So I think, when we look at this, we think that this bigger penalty associated with German-linked firms really does reflect, to some extent, greater investor pessimism at that point. Second takeaway is this. Looking at both firms linked to China and Germany, what you see is that initially, the impacts start out fairly muted, almost, right? It's less than actually roughly 0.2 percentage point penalty, but the impact amplified over time. Now, here's the interesting thing, and you might ask, for China, it sort of makes sense that both upstream and downstream were penalized. If you have a customer in China, or if you have a supplier in China, you might be affected more by the lockdown announcement. But what's going on here in Germany? Upstream firms continue to be penalized. That makes sense to me. But what's going on with the downstream firms? You see that actually roughly a week later, on average, downstream firms actually outperformed. What happened? So we dug into the German sample more. And this is when we did. We now looked at not only the interaction between lockdown and the economy, but also the sector. And we further disaggregated between upstream and downstream firms. So what do we see? This is interesting. Again, when we look at this, you can see that it is for cyclical firms in the cyclical sector, like consumer discretionary, materials. It doesn't matter if you're a supplier or a customer. You're penalized. But when you look at, say, healthcare or communications, they're actually, quote unquote, outperformed. So this speaks to us, actually, two things. When we think about, certainly in this exercise, the impact of COVID on GVC alignment, the nature of crisis mattered. Is it a supply shock? Is it a demand shock? Is it, in this case, because of the pandemic nature, healthcare outperformed. So the nature of crisis, the nature of shock matters in terms of driving GVC alignment. That's one. So back to some of the questions raised yesterday, geopolitics. Well, what are some of the policies in place? How would that drive GVC alignment? How would that drive the incentives for realignment? That matters. So that's one thing. The second thing is, yesterday, I think, we also talked about country-specific variables that drive trade. Well, this suggests to us that when you think about the impact on German firms versus on China-linked firms, the composition of industry in Germany versus China, the position of firms linked to Germany versus firms linked to China in terms of global value chain, that matters. So, right, time. Let me quickly. I'll quickly run over this. This is intuitive. So the other thing we want to look at is network distance, whether you're directly linked to the firm or you're several degrees removed. Not surprisingly, the further away you are in terms of the firms being affected, the more muted the impact is. Let me just quickly sum up because I'm out of time. Main takeaway, really, for us, and this is, by the way, work in progress. What we learned is that, again, the nature of the crisis matters, country-specific drivers matter, but more importantly, it's really hammering the point for us that we have to go granular. When we think about GVC realignment, when we think about, certainly in Hong Kong, for MA and for the work we do at BIS Hong Kong, when we think about how geopolitics might affect what we see in Asia and what we see in terms of onshoring and offshoring, we need to look at not only macro aggregate data, but we need to go granular. We need to look at sectoral data. So one of the things we're doing right now is dig into these company balance sheet data for a longer history to see if we see this kind of shifts over time. The density, the geographic realignment across different sectors, and augment that with data on intensive margin to see whether that drives or are being driven by these movements. And that's it. So we have more, there's some data here, but happy to answer questions or discuss this on a bilateral basis. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we'll open the floor for questions. Let me just begin this with asking, just it's a comment more that I know it's very fascinating to explore the sectoral dimension here, but in terms of lockdowns, there was some variation in how different countries impose them. So there are these measures that look at retail versus work mobility, how that was affected.
That's right.
So that it will be interesting to see if the upstream, downstream effects are somehow linked to the effect on the intensity of work mobility restrictions versus retail mobility restrictions.
We in one of our regressions, we included the Oxford Mobility Index, and it did not come out as significant.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. So
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it. It would be, I think, very important to use to show up your latest data in the first part of your analysis, the 2023 data that you mentioned.
March.
That would shed a lot of light into what really is sort of like not a temporary change, but this is something to stay. And on your second one, it's a 5-day average. I think if you look at it over time, you will get a different picture. In your IT sector, you probably include e-commerce, right?
I
Or
do think
something like that.
something would
So-
I see where you're getting at, right?
So it would be slightly different if that sector, e-commerce, people started to buy their food online. Nobody would go to store. It would be interesting to see what happens over an extended period of time. And you do that and you come up with certain conclusions with certain degree of certainty, then it will have implications for public policy and international trade policy. Very important. Just a suggestion. Like just thinking out loud.
I think that's a really good suggestion. And in fact, what you are saying is that we need to go even more granular. Right? So because the GIC sector, there are 11 sectors, and we are really only looking at 8 on a very aggregated, but there are within each sector, there are sub-industry sectors, and within each sub-industry sectors, there are more. So basically go granular. Point well taken. Absolutely. And you're right on your point of 15 days versus 5. Absolutely.
So fascinating work. Just 2 quick things. The first is that the China experiment seems much neater than the Germany one, right? Because you have Germany, but you have Italy, you have France, you have many other countries that at around the same time, maybe a few days apart, declared the lockdown. So is it a competition story? Like I'm happy that the German competitor shut down. So China seems neater in terms of the example. And the other thing is double thumbs up to go back. Not only forward, but I like to see these in 2017, like pre-trade war, just to link the 2 days of the conference. So
Absolutely.
that will be very interesting to see.
We're certainly doing that. And thank you for saying that China's neither. Enough said. We couldn't. Yes, thank you.
This is really great. I was pretty interested in the network analysis you did. Do you have like a summary statistic which kind of tells us where we were pre-COVID and where we are now in terms of the diffuseness of?
We do. We couldn't put it in public because it's highly suggestive, but I'll say it here with a caveat that it's purely our personal view, and also with a huge caveat that Capital IQ data set is what we see, it's 2-year window, it's not complete, all the usual. Okay. So the summary statistics is this: first of all, in terms of location, roughly 40% of the firms are Asia in this data set. Roughly 40% of firms are linked to Asia Pacific companies, and another 27% are linked to US and Canada, and 23% are linked to Germany alone. So that's a geographic. And in terms of linkages, we looked at our vantage point is looking at onshoring versus offshoring and friendshoring. And again, huge caveat, this is highly suggestive, perhaps not representative of what we see in the state of the world, but we saw a sizable, roughly 10% increase in terms of intra-US firm linkage. And that came out of China to US linkage, notable decline, and some decline in Asian economies and their linkages to the US. So this suggests that when so it goes back to actually one of the questions that we raised yesterday in terms of decoupling, the tension between decoupling and deglobalization. To what extent are you looking at spillovers from decoupling, and to what extent does that spillover include perhaps greater network interconnection elsewhere. So at first glance, what we're seeing is that it's forcing, when you force this kind of decoupling, that's happening, but you're also seeing unintended decoupling, perhaps, if you can say it that way, between some other economies and perhaps the US because of where they are in GVC network and because how they are linked to each other. So that's, but you're right, we need to go back in time and we're updating this with the March data.
This is pretty cool. Thank you very much for the fantastic presentation. Did I cut someone? No. Okay. So I have a question about supply chain resilience. It's a conceptual question I've been thinking about for a long time. So let's say China has a shock and a German firm is considering whether or not to continue sourcing from China. So which circumstance do you think can you tell that this supply chain is more resilient? So if the German firm continues to source from China, you consider that to be more resilient supply chain than say the German firm stops sourcing from China and then they turn to, for example, Vietnam. So I mean, and what can be the welfare or economic implications on the downstream German firm in these two scenarios?
Right. I mean, that's a profound question, right? From a policy perspective, how do you measure resilience, right? Is resilience defined by the flexibility of your GVC network? Or is resilient, in which case, then the ease with which you can shift your production from one locale to another, say textile, that's a highly resilient network, perhaps. Or is resilient defined by, say, the economic impact that from either the supplier's perspective or the customer's perspective? So I think it really depends on where you're coming from. I don't have one answer to that. In how we measure this, GVC resilience, to us actually is, as macroeconomists, we're looking at this purely from the impact on growth. That if you have X number of decline in linkages, do you see a correspondent impact on growth? Or do you see that impact as fairly muted? That's where we're coming from.
So, yeah, I think we have time for 2 more questions from. So you please go ahead and then. Yep.
Trying to understand, is decoupling the reason for the asymmetric response to the 2 different geographies lockdown? I don't quite get it because the sectoral impact should be identical.
In theory.
Right? But why is the response function asymmetric?
Right. So I think it goes to the, I don't think it's necessarily decoupling at that moment, because if anything, what we learned is that when you try to decouple for some of these sectors, it's incredibly difficult to disentangle your linkages. The sectoral, the difference between the countries and between different sectors, I would say, goes down to country-specific variables. And this is something we're digging deeper into, which is the composition of your industries in each economy. What's the bulk of, what share does, say, communications equipment represent for Germany versus for China? What share does automotive manufacturing represent for Germany versus for China? So the composition of your industry matters, but also where you are in GVC. Are you more backward linked to the global trade network or more forward linked? Are you more dependent on inputs? Do you contribute more to others' exports? So I think that's the deeper question that we are actually looking into at the moment.
Thank you, Lauren.
Just a very quick question. When you take the network into COVID, you see that linkages are dropping, right? There's less linkages. Do firm size grow? So did they pick up the slack? You have you can look at centrality, for example, and see if they become more central and hence there might be less linkages, but actually, capacity is just.
Yeah.
Safe.
Fascinating question. we could look into that using the balance sheet data. I don't have an answer to that because we haven't looked into that. But I have two answers. I have 2 points I want to make. One is that in terms of the decline of 30%, we actually, it's the aggregate number of linkages. So that accounted for new connections that happened over those 2 years. But the second thing I want to point out is this shipment data, bill of lading data. This is not a chart that would tell a very clear story, but I want to, but there's something that's quite interesting that I was trying to say yesterday. We saw looking at US shipment data, that you see a decline in the number of shippers and decline in the number of suppliers linked to US firms during the pandemic. And there's actually, if you look at this left-hand panel, you can see, in fact, the number of firms generally fell. But there's tremendous variation in terms of intensive margin. This is proxied by the TEU, the 10 equivalent of shipment volume. So what that tells us actually is that for those firms that actually stayed in business, they were able to ramp up their productive capacity a lot quicker. And that helped to offset this overall decline in number of suppliers. So that was part of the reason why it bounced back. So it's an indirect way of answering your question. Did firms grow bigger? Did those that survived, were they able to benefit? Don't have the answer to that directly, but does suggest that there is some wiggle room, some flexibility with which that they could respond to greater demand. I'm out of time, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Hello, testing. Okay, thank you everyone for being here. I'm looking forward to your comments and your suggestions. Let's see. Okay, so this is a paper about spatial concentration of economic activity. If you think about one economic geography of the world, like one very notable feature is like how concentrated in space the population of and the economic activity is. And you can think also that in some countries the population is more concentrated geographically than in others. So if you think of Argentina, Argentina has a huge share of its population in the biggest city of Buenos Aires. So it's like super concentrated. If you think of Germany, it has like several major cities and the population the urban system is not as concentrated. Also, over time, the concentration of a country can change. So the broad question that we're asking here is like, which factors are responsible for determining how concentrated the population is and how that changes over time. Concentration itself is an important topic. And one reason why arguably it's an important topic is that there's a big association between concentration and economic development. More big agglomerations of population are associated to innovation, to higher consumption patterns, and to many things associated with development. And so if we understand the factors that are behind that influence concentration, we can also understand and try to predict how future developments in the world economy could change, could affect concentration. There's current concern with pandemics, with protectionism and the retreat of globalization more generally. So if trade is one of the factors that affects concentration, given that some people worry that, as we've been discussing, that globalization may be retreat, if you understand the factors, we can better understand what to expect in the future in terms of concentration. Another feature that has been ongoing in the global economy is the transition of developing countries away from agriculture, so-called structural transformation. And if also that is a factor behind concentration, and if we expect this structural transformation to keep happening in the near future, as we probably do, then it's also useful to know how that could affect concentration in the future. Okay, so what are the drivers of concentration? In this paper, I look at 3 factors that have been proposed to influence concentration in the past. So the traditional urban economics literature talks a lot about the specifics of the location-specific fundamentals, like productivities and amenities. So some places are more, some places have higher amenities, so they have like better weather, or they have more pleasant features to live for some reason. And other regions have better productivities than others. So they have, for many reasons, they produce more, they are better for production than others. So traditionally, these are 2 big reasons for why population would be located in one place and not in another. Another kind of somewhat separate literature talks about access to trade networks as being important. So if you have good access to trade networks, maybe because you're a port city, it's very easy to buy and sell goods from that location. That location becomes attractive, so that also influences the spatial distribution. And then there is also another literature that talks about structural transformation, which is what I just mentioned, going away from agriculture and going into industry. And if that is in services and like non-agriculture in general, and if that's also that also affects can also affect the geographical location of people on space. So moreover, if you look at a super bird's eye view, you see that these factors have been changing over time. So and then they're correlated with each other. So in this graph, you can see that the agricultural employment in the world as a whole has been going down, which is like one way to measure structural transformation. And then the imports of goods and services in the period that I'm analyzing here went up. So we see like globalization, integration happening at the same time. And if you look at a measure of concentration that I will use in this paper, which is the primacy rate, I'll explain soon, that has been rising a little bit between the 70s and the 2010s. So that is more like, it's not any kind of causal evidence, but it's just like correlations that make us think and wonder whether, to what extent these factors are by each other. So what I'll do in this paper is I'll take a quantitative spatial model, and I use that modern quantitative spatial model to investigate in the real world, like what are the contributions of each of these 3 factors that I mentioned before: the fundamentals, the trade access, and the structural transformation. So I'll do this in these 5 steps that I'm describing here. So the first thing is to take the quantitative spatial model that we use as our framework, and we will have to make a little bit of a change on it, because if you want to study structural transformation as one of the factors, we have to include it in the model. So I do this by adding non-homothetic preferences to this model. And then the model, as one of its byproducts, will yield an expression that allows us to do an accounting, a kind of a decomposition or accounting exercise, where each of the 3 drivers' contribution can be understood through this equation. So then next, I will bring this model to the data. And 2 and 3 here are the main steps that we need to bring the model to the data. So first, because the trade cost is such an important feature of the model, I will use data from a long time period to estimate the global trade cost structure of the world. And then next, I will calibrate the model to the world economy for 2 time periods. And when I say calibration, I'm using the word calibration here in the sense that I'm using the model to find the amenities and the productivities across the world, where that justify the rationalize the observed distribution of population and wages that we see in the data. And I'll do this using a very big data set that I've built that has most of the countries of the world, 192 countries. And then within each country, we will break it down under subnational units. So in total, we have 1,600 subnational units. That's like states and provinces, the different constituent parts of countries. So once we calibrate the model, then we can use the model first to do like some counterfactual exercises to try to understand a little better, like how does the trade access channel influence the concentration. And so we take the model that's been calibrated for 2005, and then we shock this model with different alternative counterfactual trade cost structures. And by doing this, we can we compare the equilibrium, the original equilibrium to the counterfactual equilibrium, and we can see how the trade shock has affected concentration. And then finally, I use the equation that I mentioned above to do an accounting exercise. So I look at the world in 1990 and then again in 2005. I see how concentration changed between these two time periods, and I use that, and then I explain that change in concentration by the change in each of the three factors using this decomposition equation, this accounting equation that I mentioned above. And I'll tell you the results up front that the overwhelming majority of the change is due to the local fundamentals according to the model. So while trade does affect concentration, I forgot to mention this, that in the counterfactuals, trade decreases concentration for most countries. So why that happens in the model, in practice, that in the real world, the model seems to say that this was swamped by changes in the fundamentals and when explaining the actual changes that happen in the world, with structural transformation and trade access playing a minute role compared to these other factors. Okay, so I'll not spend time here, but just say that there is a literature on trade networks, structural transformation, quantitative spatial models, and I'm kind of working in the context of these three literatures at the same time, kind of bringing them together in a way, and also mention that there's this question of trade and concentration. There was a very old literature from the 90s that tackle this, which is not, I guess, it's not that discussed anymore, but we're kind of speaking to that as well. In a very different, using a model, modern quantitative spatial model that's very different from what people used in those times. Hopefully can address the data, look at the data in a little bit more structured way compared to them. Okay, so start with the framework, the theoretical framework that I use. This theoretical framework is, I'm not going to go, for the sake of time, into any detail what I'm doing. Let me just give you a super high-level overview of the model. And so the model is a quantitative spatial model in this tradition of modern quantitative spatial models. And so what is different from this model to those ones? There's a couple of relatively small changes. So many, if not most if not all of these countries, of these models, they use the quantitative spatial models in a context of a given country. So like different states or counties inside one country. What I'm doing is like looking at the whole world. So in international context, I'm looking at the whole world at the same time. So the world in the model is like constituted of hundreds of countries, and then these countries are divided into like thousands of subnational locations, like states or provinces. And I'm taking this model and I'm including non-homothetic preferences over the two sectors of the model, agriculture and whatever is not agriculture, the rest. So by doing this, I can incorporate the structural transformation channel into the model. So now the model that already had naturally had the differential trade access channel and the fundamentals channel also will now have the structural transformation channel. So in this model, the agents can migrate across the domestic locations, but not internationally. So you can think of I'm an agent living in the United States, and I'm born in the United States. I can choose to move to New York or California or Texas, but not move to Canada. And as the shocks act on this model, they will make people choose to move around within their country, which will result on the country becoming perhaps more concentrated in one city or less concentrated in that city. But I'm kind of ruling out international migration to simplify this. And in the data, I guess the literature says that the internal migrations are more significant than international migration by like order of magnitude in the data. So anyway, it's a simplifying assumption, but it's not, for our purposes, not too much of odds with the relevant data. Apart from this, the model, generally speaking, is pretty conventional in terms of quantitative spatial model. What I would point out is like we have these local fundamentals here. So the productivities and amenities that I mentioned before at the regional level, and they are heterogeneous. So some locations will have higher and others will have lower productivities and amenities. And then there is iceberg trade costs across locations, which that's where the idea of differential trade costs will come from. Because if I am in a port city, like I can buy goods very cheaply from or very easily from across the world. If I am like in the inside of the country, in the hinterland, I have bad infrastructure, it's hard for me to buy the goods. So this trade access, this iceberg trade cost will be an ingredient in the model that will be important. Okay, so this, I won't go into any detail in this equation, but basically the model has an equilibrium system. We impose the market clearing conditions. We can, given the fundamentals of the model, which are the black variables, and the parameters, you can use the model to back out the endogenous variables, which are the red variables here. And I'll just bring your attention to so the price indices of different locations. So the subscript here is like a location, right? So Li is like the population of location I, and you can also have you have the wage of location I, and you have the prices P, which is like the agricultural price and the non-agricultural price in location J or location I. Anyway, you don't have to understand the details of this. The point is like the model computes an equilibrium with endogenous variables, and so under some mild assumptions, the model also delivers us an equation that I'll use later for decomposition. So this equation goes like this. I think I said I was going to explain this, but I didn't. So sorry for that. So one metric we use in this paper is the primacy rate, which is a common measure in like this older literature. So the primacy, so the biggest location or region or city in a country is called the primate city in this literature. And the primacy rate is what the fraction of the population of the country that lives in the biggest city. So in Argentina, like Buenos Aires has like half of the population of the country. So the primacy rate is 50%. So the primacy rate of a country is defined as the population L of its biggest city, which I'm calling the primate city of country C, and divided by the total population of country C. So that's just the definition of primacy. So what the model is telling us is like this ratio depends on some of the variables of the model. Again, like you don't have to see all the detail of the equation. The point here is we have an expression evaluated at P of C, so evaluated at the primate location, divided by the same expression evaluated at the summation of all locations inside that country. So the intuition is that the concentration in a country will depend on the relative quality of the primate city respective to other cities or to other locations, sorry. And then that term here, this term here, includes the factors the three factors that we've been talking about. So the U bar is the U bar variable is the fundamental amenity of a location. We have this A bar that represents the fundamental productivity of a location. So the red variables are the fundamentals, the local fundamentals. You have this epsilon, which is the agricultural expenditure share. So the orange variable represents the structural transformation part of the model. And then you have these blue variables, the rho I and pi I, which are the consumer trade axis and the producer trade axis. And you can see that these variables depend on like the tau here, which is the trade cost, and they depend on the price index in that location, which actually probably I should have written the equation here, but the price index depends on tau as well, on the transportation costs. So basically, big picture, we have an equation here that gives us that tells us that the concentration of population and location is related to the three factors that we've been talking about, according to the way that. Okay, so basically, you take that equation that I just showed. You use logs, you differentiate the equation, and you can now decompose the primacy. You get the decomposition equation that I was talking about. So okay, there's a lot of stuff in here. So basically, just focusing your attention up here. The change in the log of the primacy of a country can be divided into three terms, and these three terms that are open up here. The first one involves the epsilon, which is the structural transformation variable. The third one involves the locational fundamentals, amenities, and productivities. And the second one involves pi and some other variable here, I, that if you look down here, depends on prices. So this has to do with the trade access of the location, like how good the trade location is. Okay, so given that we have a model, the model has a decomposition equation. Now it's time to bring the model to the data. Given that I only have 4 minutes, I'll perhaps go very fast through this. So first, I have to estimate the global trade costs because I want to know what that pi variable, the tau variable, the trade cost variable is. So basically, I impose some parametric assumptions on the trade cost. And then by plugging this trade cost into the gravity trade equation that the model derives, I get an estimable equation for the trade costs. The key parameter that I parameterize here is the border crossing parameter, which basically is like a dummy that turns on whenever I'm selling internationally. I'm selling to a buyer that's in another country. And this part here has to do with distance. So it's like a more conventional cost of distance term. So I estimate the cost of distance. Okay, I'll just skip this. So here is perhaps the more relevant part. I estimate the cost of shipping things internationally over time for agriculture, for non-agriculture. And I do this year by year from the 60s up to now. And you see there's a decrease. So if you compare like 2005, you have here a cost of around 2 for agriculture. And if you take like 1970, the cost was almost 3. So you see like a substantial decline in the trade cost, international trade cost over time. This is what I'm calling kind of globalization in the perspective of this model. Next, I solve the equilibrium system, given this tau hat that we just created, that are just computed. I use data on wages and population across the 1,600 locations I was talking about. And the equation allows us to back out the productivities and amenities that rationalize the model. So this is this is the map of the world. You can see like the countries are divided in small units, and that's the productivities that the model back out. You can see that the richer countries have higher productivities, both in agriculture and non-agriculture, which is like intuitive. And so now, okay, so having calibrated the model, let's use the model to do counterfactual, where we shock the trade cost to see how the trade cost affects the concentration. And then lastly, we'll use the accounting equation to see how much each of the three factors contributed to the change, the concentration we see in the data. So there's two counterfactuals I do. One is like super liberalization. I set the border crossing costs that we estimated to 0. So it's as if the world is now completely integrated. There's no border crossing cost. And the second counterfactual is I roll back the trade cost structure of the world all the way back to 1971. So that's like changing trade policy to make it as it was 50 years ago. You can think of this as liberalization, and this is like anti-liberalization. So when you do liberalization, what happens to the population across the world? So the darker colors is the regions of the country where the population goes up, and light colors go down. So in China, you see Western China, when we liberalize the world economy, Western China gains population, Eastern China loses population, and that's a pattern that manifests across countries in general. The regions like the Eastern China that are big, that have lots of people in concentration, they shrink, and the more deserted regions grow. So that's a deconcentrating effect, like the countries are becoming deconcentrated, which is what this negative correlation between initial population share and change of population is telling us. When we roll back the clock to 1971 trade costs, you have the opposite result. So the big parts of China grow even more. The more deserted parts of China shrink even more in terms of population. So basically, both counterfactuals tell us the same thing. The trade has a deconcentrating effect. Skip over this. Now, for change accounting, I'm taking that, I'm calibrating the model to 2 years, 1990 and 2015, as I mentioned before. And I'm using the model I'm using the decomposition equation, the very big equation that I showed earlier, to decompose, to see the contribution of each of the 3 factors to the change that we see in the data for that sample of 1,600 countries that I was talking about, that I showed you. Okay, and this, before I show you the final results, this graph here gives us a little bit of an idea. So if you look at the United Kingdom, the golden bar is the change that you observed in concentration over time. And the green or dark green bar is the contribution that the model tells us that the local fundamentals made to the change in concentration. So you can see that these two bars are very close to each other in all the, not all, but most of the countries. So that means that the fundamentals are really what's explaining the change in primacy, generally speaking. And then I do a decomposition of variance to reinforce that point. So I take the variation that I have in my sample in the change of primacy, and I use like the variance decomposition to show how much of the variance comes from each of the 3 channels, as well from the correlations. And then you see that the variance of the local fundamentals is 103%. It can be bigger than 1 because you can have like negative contributions from the correlations. So basically the whole change in the sample, the change that I observed over this time period is completely due to changes in fundamentals, and the trade and structural transformation their role is dwarfed by. Okay, so yeah, so in this paper, just to recapitulate, I augmented a quantitative spatial model with non-homothetic preferences to study the 3 drivers of spatial concentration: trade, fundamentals, and structural transformation. And I bring the model to the data, and I do counterfactuals that show that trade decreased concentration. But then I also do a decomposition exercise that shows that trade, compared to local fundamentals, had a minor role in practice in the 15 years between 1990 and 2005. Thank you.
Excellent. Just want to highlight that Malaysia was, I think, one of the largest countries to get the increase in primacy. Right?
Let's see. I should have looked at the number out before. Yeah, Malaysia. Malaysia is here, right? Oh yeah. So this right graph is the country that became more concentrated in this period. Malaysia is, yeah, I guess is the one that had the highest increase in concentration.
No, I just wanted to highlight that. But okay, so we'll open the floor to any questions or comments.
Yeah.
So this is a really nice paper. If I understand correctly, the local fundamentals is an error term, essentially.
Yes.
And so you have labeled it local fundamentals, and it therefore explains, and it explains much of the variation in the data. But then we could equally say that the model is just misspecified. And so then you just have a bunch of error that's explaining things. And so you don't have a separate parameter in the model that is a structural error term. It's like everything is loaded onto this. So it's a little bit like it would be nice to have some piece of information that puts a bit more structure on the local fundamentals rather than being a freely kind of backed out residual. No?
So do you have in mind something perhaps like some sort of parameterization based on like observed variables, like the weather in a location?
There's a big debate, as you know, on how to back that out. But it's just like we leave with the conclusion that it's local fundamentals, but local fundamentals is the error. And so then if it's the error, then we don't know if it's a model misspecification or truly local fundamentals that's capturing things. So it's just, it'd be not like one thing that you could do is you could take the local fundamentals and you could project them. So leave it as you're doing it in the model, but then convince us that local fundamentals is correlated with things that we think would be features of amenities like the things that you were saying.
Yeah. The map that I showed, like the flavor of this map here was a little bit of that, because it's like the productivities that came out of the model, like
Yeah.
correlating to like where.
Yeah, but you have these fundamentals at the regional level, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so.
You can also leverage that. Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you. That's a.
So can I ask one more question then? Is like you focused on the primacy, but does your model generate a Zipf's law for population by location?
Haven't.
Because there's an alternative way to discipline the data, which is to say that we're going to impose Zipf's law, which is a regularity in the data, and then impose Gibrat's law, which is going to be that the large cities just grow independent of size. And that would be another piece of structure you could add.
Right. Yeah, because as it stands, I think the Zipf's law being there or not would depend on the particular.
On the parameterization
Yeah,
of the productivity.
so it's not like inbuilt, I think.
Yeah.
So okay, so it's a margin of adjustment that I have that I can use to structure it.
Yeah, exactly. And that
Okay.
would also then pin down. It would chip away from how much you're loading on the residuals.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
To follow up on this, I think you can do something like the Berlin Wall paper, right? To sort of endogenize, allocations productivity as a function of local population. So that's the agglomeration force, right? And you can, introduce another sort of congestion force that makes population concentration less desirable. For example, like housing costs or traffic congestion, right? So with that, you can sort of understand, what part of this is, structural and what part of this is error, right? So just my 2 cents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Thank you. That's good. No, not. Yeah, no. Yeah, I kind of skipped over. Yeah, I kind of skipped over this for the sake of time, but the productivities and amenities, both, they have both an exogenous and an endogenous component. So when I talk about fundamentals here, I'm talking about the exogenous component of them, but they also have a congestion parameter that depends on the local population, and the agglomeration parameter that also depends on the local population. Yes, indirectly. Yeah, in the general equilibrium. There's no direct effect, no. Yeah. I mean, if I may take 1 second to talk about a finding that was somewhat interesting, is the thing that I mentioned, that trade has a deconcentrating effect, like the China example that I mentioned. So here, when you shock the model with a different counterfactual trade shock, the border crossing trade shock, it affects all locations proportionately the same, because it's just like a shock that, yeah. So the interior of China and the coast of China have like the same relative change. So why does through the differential trade costs, they see these differences in effect, if it's not because of that? And that has to do with the kind of self-feeding mechanism of the model. And that's actually the part that echoes Krugman's old models that I mentioned at the beginning. His models show that it's a completely theoretical, it's like no data at all, but he argues that more trade leads to the concentration because of this kind of self-reinforcing mechanism. So we kind of seem to find this in the data through this model.
Any more comments or questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Eduardo. And that concludes our first session of the day. So we'll now have a quick coffee and tea break, and we'll reconvene back at 11:10 a.m. for our second session, Trends in Investment. Thank you. Hello, Andre. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Hello, Andre?
Oh,
We can't hear him.
a second. Can you hear me now? No?
Can you try to say something?
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah. We'll turn the volume up.
Okay. What about now?
Yes, better.
Okay, cool. I'll try to speak closer.
Okay, we have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Or you start.
So, but this way you hear, right?
Yes. Right.
Okay, thank you.
Mic test. Yeah. Test. As we are about to begin, please be seated. Mic test, 1, 2, 3. We are about to begin our next session on trends in investment, where we have two presenters. The first presenter who will be presenting online is Mr. Andre Presbitero, who will be presenting online from the IMF. And the second presenter today will be Sergio Schmuckler from the World Bank, as before. Each presenter will have 40 minutes allocated for each paper, 25 minutes for their presentation, and another 15 minutes for open-ended discussion. Please allow the presenters to present 5 minutes without interrupting them before asking any clarifying questions. And for the YouTube audience, you may place your questions in the chat box and we will get to your questions at an appropriate time. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Andre for his presentation. Thank you.
Hello. So thank you very much, and thanks to the organizer for inviting the paper in the conference, and thank you also for allowing us to sort of present remotely. Unfortunately, I would have loved to be there, but in the very end, it was impossible to travel. So let me know if you don't hear and interrupt if anything is unclear. So I'm gonna present sort of some work done for the one of the analytical chapter of the latest World Economic Outlook, which have been released in a couple of weeks ago. And this is joint work with several colleagues, which are listed in here. And we're looking at sort of how geoeconomic tensions can affect foreign direct investment. So let me dive into the analysis. So we motivate our analysis to sort of two set of style facts. The first one is relatively straightforward, especially to this kind of audience, and is pictured on the slide on the chart on the left, which has been showing sort of this globalization, which like economists have been discussing for quite some time. The only thing we want sort of to take out from this chart is that if we look at foreign direct investment, even though there are some measurement issues in the aggregate, we can still see that, you know, they after the global financial crisis, have been declining quite substantially, even much more than trade, instead sort of slowed down. The other issue is that first of all, with the pandemic, then supply chain disruption and rising geopolitical tensions has brought the risks and potential cost of fragmentation to the center of the policy debate. And the chart on the right shows a couple of things that sort of support this idea. The blue dashed line show index of geopolitical risk. In particular, this one is the one by Caldara and Jacobiello, which shows that, you know, starting with COVID-19, and even more so with the war, like this is a sharp rise in geopolitical risk. At the same time, there is an interest in reshoring and friendshoring, both from sort of the corporate side and firms, but also from policymakers. If you think about like what Janet Yellen has said like last year in 2022 about the need for US corporates to reshore and friendshore investment to trusted allies, similar declaration done by EU leaders, and even more recently again Janet Yellen. That sort of suggests that from a policy side, there is a lot of interest in thinking about ways to bring back part of the investment to sort of make supply chain more resilient. On the other hand, if we look at the firm side, we can also see an interest by companies in reshoring and friendshoring. And this is what has been shown by the red line on the chart on the right, which basically it's a count measure computed using earning cost data, in which we look at, you know, how frequent it is for companies to mention reshoring, friendshoring, and onshoring. And you can see again, this has been increasing more or less around the US-China trade war, but then it has spiked even more like during COVID, and even more so with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So moving from this sort of two stylized facts, what we try to do, we want to analyze how geoeconomic fragmentation can affect FDI, and therefore how this can also generate spillover to the global economy. So while we zoom in on FDI, clearly there is a large literature already and a growing literature that looks at fragmentation and trade and the effects of trade fragmentation on the economy. There's other papers, and actually their colleagues at the fund was looking at sort of non-FDI flows, therefore like the potential effect of fragmentation in cross-border bank lending and portfolio flows. Here we zoom in on FDI flows for three main reasons. The first of all is FDI, at least there is an association in the aggregate data between FDI inflows and GDP growth, especially in emerging markets, and the usual channel is technology diffusion. And this is shown in the chart on the left. The chart on the right tells you also that FDI is relatively important as a source of capital stock in recipient economies. You can see that on average, FDI account for about like 12% of the stock of capital, with sort of, you know, variation across countries, but you know, this sort of importance of FDI is common across different regions. And the final point, because we think that looking at FDI is important, is that if we look at firms which at least are planning or thinking about reshoring and friendshoring, and again, we look at, you know, firms which mention reshoring and friendshoring in earning calls, and then we look at those firm characteristics, we see that those firms tend to be larger, more knowledge intensive, and more profitable, as is shown in the chart in the middle. This suggests that if in a fragmentation scenario, if those firms were the one leaving destination economies, then the effects on host countries would be much larger, because exactly this the characteristic of those firms. So what we try to answer, which are the questions we want to answer in the paper? First of all, we want to see like if there are already signs of fragmentation in FDI flows. Then we want to sort of go one step further and try to see if geopolitical factor, geopolitical tension are actually one key element behind any recent trend in FDI flows. And then we try to build a measure of to measure which countries are actually more vulnerable and exposed to reshoring and friendshoring. And in the final part of the paper, we do two things. First, we want to try to quantify the effect of the relocation of FDI. And first of all, we look at, again, at the literature on spillover in FDI to try to provide some more evidence. And finally, we use a model to estimate the economic cost of fragmentation and also try to understand how these costs are distributed across countries and regions in the world. So let me look at the first part, which are sort of some stats and facts of what has been happening on foreign direct investment. So here we use data, investment level data from FDI markets. So these are data starting in 2003 up to December last year, and they cover about 300,000 investment across the globe. So here what we do, we look at count investment and we look at FDI in specific sectors. For instance, the chart on the left, look at FDI in strategic sectors. And we simply zoom in on specific regions. So FDI going to Asia, splitting China and the rest of Asia, which are the red lines. And then we look at the FDI going to the US or to Europe. And as you can see in all the three charts, there is some evidence, at least, of regionalization in flows, meaning that FDI to Europe and the US has been much more resilient, starting after the trade tension and then even more so during the pandemic and the war, than FDI going to Asia, and especially those going to China. This is true if you look at FDI in strategic sector, which we define in a very standard way. So think about pharma, semiconductors, rare earth, mineral, and similar products. It's even more evident if you look at FDI for research and development, which are the chart in the middle, in which clearly China lags behind, and where instead there is a much sharper sort of catching up in Asia in the most recent quarters. And this is similar trend is look if we zoom in even more and we look only at FDI in the semiconductor industry. So this is basically what has been happening in the last recent years, and zooming in on a specific region. Then we try to sort of provide a sort of more general evidence of sort of reallocation of FDI across regions. And here we compare the flows, again, looking at the count of investment, comparing the period post-pandemic, so 2020 Q2 up to December 2022, versus some sort of medium average pre-pandemic, so between 2015 and the beginning of 2020. And then we divide the world in regions, and we plot like the source region by rows and destination region by columns. And then we look at the change in FDI between the post and the pre-pandemic period in deviation from aggregate change, when the cell in red means that those flows are going much worse than the global average, and the one in red instead are going better than in green instead are going better than the average. There are a number of stylistic facts from this chart, but I want to point your attention to a couple of things. First of all, like if you look at China, Asia, and even more so China as a destination region, you can see that this is sort of a sea of red. So these are the regions which in relative terms lost more compared to other regions. Okay? Clearly, one can say there's a lot of things going on. It's nothing to do with sort of fragmentation and tension. It could be simply like zero COVID policy in China, for instance. That explains why FDI to China has been doing much worse than the average. That's probably true. However, if you look at China as a destination region, and then you look at difference across source regions, so you look at difference across rows, you can see there is a lot of variation. So this would suggest that it's, you know, what has been happening is not only due to factors which are specific of the destination region, in this case China, and that applies also to other countries. If you look, for instance, at the bottom row, and if you look at FDI coming from the US to different regions, again, you see a lot of variation of US outward FDI, with a very sharp fall in investment going to China, but in relative terms, an increase in those going, for instance, to other regions in the Americas, and to emerging Europe. To try to get a bit more sense of what is really happening, we want to look within specific region. In the chart on the right, we look at the similar change in pre and post pandemic. We only look at US the investment out of the US to specific countries in the Americas and in Asia. Specifically, we look at the top recipient of US FDI. And then we rank again those countries from the one who gained the most in relative terms on the left, and those who lost the most on the right. And here what is interesting is that if you look at the distribution of those countries, those who seems to gain in relative terms are generally countries which are politically closer to the US. Think about Costa Rica, Colombia, Canada, and Korea, for instance. On the other hand, the countries that sort of generally tend to lose market share are countries which are farther away in terms of geopolitical alignment with the US. Think about China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. So this would suggest that some elements of geopolitics could be behind this sort of trend that we have seen in different sort of regionalization or clustering of FDI flows. So then in the next step, we look at more closely at the role of geopolitical alignment. So let me go back quickly again on the kind of data that we have. I already mentioned you have this investment level information of about 300,000 FDI since 2003. This comes from FDI market database from Financial Times. And we have some information also the kind of investment, which allow us to look at sort of specific sectors, for instance, and clearly look at source and destination country. Then the key point for us is measuring sort of geopolitical alignment between country pairs. The way we do that is using a sort of voting pattern at the United Nations General Assembly. And we use one specific measure in all the results that I'm going to show to you, which is the ideal point distance proposed by Bailey and others, which is widely used not only in economics, but even more so in political science and related literature. We do a lot of robustness with several other measures, and the results go through. Then, so we use data, as I mentioned, from text mining of earning costs to define strategic sectors. And then we have a standard bilateral, standard gravity measure coming from the CIP bilateral dataset. So what's the role of geopolitical alignment in driving FDI flows? Here we show a couple of, again, descriptive part, and then we show results from a gravity. So the chart on the left clearly shows the geopolitical distance matter in the allocation of FDI. So what we plot here in the blue line is the share of FDI taking place between countries pairs which are geopolitically very close. So in practice, what we do, we look for each country at the geopolitical distance vis-a-vis the US. Then we rank countries for those very close to the US up to those very far from the US. And then we divide those countries in quintiles. And then we compute the FDI that goes, the FDI flows between countries which are among themselves very, very close, meaning FDI going to countries which are very close to the US, FDI among countries which are very far from the US, and so on and so forth. In practice, we basically have this distinction of countries into quintiles. We have source and destination. We sum the FDI in the main diagonal, and these are basically the share of total FDI. Given that we divide everything in quintile, if geopolitical distance were not to matter at all, it would be totally random, then that share should be 20%. The chart in the left shows you the share is about 40% at the beginning of the period, and what is more interesting and important, that share has been increasing over time up to 52% by 2021. That suggests that geopolitical distance has a sort of important role in trying to explaining the allocation of FDI. If we do the same exercise with geographical distance, which we find that the role of geographical distance, which is the red line, is much less important than that of geopolitical distance. The chart on the right simply tries to explain what is behind the acceleration in the role of geopolitical distance in explaining FDI allocation. And then we split FDI between strategic FDI and other FDI. And then we simply plot the growth rate. So we normalize the series to be 1 at the beginning of the period. And what you can see is that the sharp increase that we observe in the blue line on the left is driven most entirely by strategic FDI. So this again could be driven by a lot of other things. It's purely descriptive. We can pick up a lot of other factors. So to try to sort of tease out the effect of geopolitical distance, we estimate a very standard gravity model, which is shown in the equation on the right, in which FDI between country pairs like source S and destination country B in a given period, generally we work with yearly data T, is a function of what? Of our measure of geopolitical distance between source and destination, which we lag by 1 year, a set of fixed effect, which is source time year and destination time year fixed effects, which absorb any sort of like push and pull factor which could drive FDI. And then we control for a standard set of characteristics which varies across country pair. And those are generally like geographical distance, common culture and language and history and so on and so forth. So we run this sort of very standard gravity model, and we get the results which are plotted for simplicity on the left. Our baseline results show that there's a negative association between this ideal point distance and the FDI inflows. And the idea here is that if we move from the first to the third quartile of ideal point distance, which is basically like moving from, let's say, the distance between France and UK and the distance between France and India, we see that FDI goes down by about 17%. We also show that this effect is generally much larger. This correlation is much larger when we look at FDI going to emerging market and developing economies. It changes over time, and what is more important is that it becomes larger in the last 4 years compared to what it was in the period post-global financial crisis. And also this correlation is larger if we look at the strategic FDI compared to when we look at other non-strategic FDI. Then we have lot of robustness we can discuss later on in the discussion.
5 minutes left.
Yes. So we do like 2 more things. So one is like trying to have a sense of what is the exposure of countries to the potential reshoring. And so we constructed a multidimensional index of vulnerability to relocation. So here, the intuition is that we have 3 dimensions. One is the geopolitical dimension, and the idea is that countries which has a lot of FDI coming from economies which are farther away in terms of geopolitical distance would be more vulnerable to reshoring. Then you have a dimension of market power, which suggests that economies which have a lot of FDIs, instinctively which they have a lot of market power, meaning they're top exporters, given will be sort of somewhat insulated because it will be much more difficult for multinational to relocate in other countries. And finally, there is a strategic component, and the idea is that if there is a lot of FDIs in a country, in strategic component, those countries will be particularly vulnerable to relocation because there will be a lot of pressure from source economies, meaning policymakers and companies, to relocate and bring back those investments. So we have this 3 dimension. Let me skip on how we do that. We can come back. The bottom line is shown on the chart on the right here. That basically we can construct this index which varies between 0 and 1. And what we can show is that generally emerging markets are much more vulnerable than advanced economies to the risk of FDI to be relocated. That said, this vulnerability is not only common of a few countries, as you can see in the scatter plot, but it's common across many countries and across all regions. And even in advanced economies, some countries are particularly vulnerable, especially those which have a lot of sort of FDI in strategic sectors. Let me move now to the last part of the analysis, in which we have this model which try to quantify the effect of fragmentation. So what we do, we have a multi-country, multi-region DSG model, which is the IMF Global Integrated Monetary and Fiscal Model. We adapt the model to try to simulate the fragmentation in FDI. The model allows up to 8 regions, and the regions are listed in the table. So we have the United States, China, Europe, other advanced economies, and then we split Asia in India, Indonesia, and Southeast Asia. Then we have Latin America and the rest of the world. The idea of having these 8 regions is that we want to simulate scenarios, hypothetical scenarios, in which we split the world into 2 blocks, one closer to the US and the other closer to China, and we want some regions to be somewhat not aligned. So the way we allocate the region to two blocks is simply data-driven. We use, again, this measure of the geopolitical distance. We compute the average geopolitical distance vis-a-vis the US and China for each of the region. And then we can see the US, Europe, and advanced economies will basically form the United States bloc. China, Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world will go into the China bloc. And India, Indonesia, and Latin America will be non-aligned. Then, how we model FDI fragmentation? So we model as a permanent rise in cross-block investment barriers. So we have this increase in non-tariff barriers, which are going to impact the capital stock and the productivity. So the first layer effect is an effect that goes through investment. And so we simulate a sort of higher non-tariff barriers across opposing blocks, meaning that they mimic a 50% reduction on the input investment goods from the opposing block members. Clearly, countries which are non-aligned instead can still sort of import investment inputs from both blocks. This in a situation in which there is full certainty. The point is that, and we will try to model that, there's a lot of uncertainty about future alignment choices of countries and regions that try to stay non-aligned. If this is the case, it's great uncertainty, some sort of an option value to invest. And so we want to model this uncertainty. And therefore, under uncertainty, we assume that even non-aligned countries face barriers for opposite blocks, like 50% of those barriers. Secondly, we have some sort of second round effect on productivity, assuming that, if, especially for emerging market, if there are lower investment inputs or lower FDI coming in, then there will be an effect on productivity. So which is the results from the simulation of the model. So as I said, we split the world between two blocks, and these are the main effect. So overall, in the long run, we see that global GDP will be lower than from a scenario without fragmentation of about 2%. Most of the effect comes from lower investment, a little bit comes from the productivity losses. This 2% is unequally distributed across regions. The China bloc being affected the most, and the reason is that there's a lot of pre-existing linkages with the opposite bloc. So if we sever those linkages, that bloc, those regions will be affected the most because they will not receive FDI inflows. On the other hand, the US bloc is affected the less for exactly the same region because they can still get a lot of investment from within the bloc. The non-aligned region, in a scenario in which there is full certainty, so they can still import from both sides, are basically unaffected. The only negative effect is some sort of general equilibrium negative effect. That said, we can also show that if you have a higher substitution, they can also sort of benefit from investment diversion, is shown in the chart on the left, meaning they can benefit from some of the investment which are relocated from one block and they have to go somewhere and they can go to the either Indian region or that said, if we allow for the presence of uncertainty, meaning that then the non-aligned will face barriers with opposing blocks, then the effect of uncertainty trumps everything else, and those countries will also have a negative effect on global GDP in the long term. Then we do several other exercises to see what happens to this region when they join different blocks. Bottom line is that we're better off joining the US bloc and the China bloc, again, because of the pre-existing linkages. Final point, and I'm done, is that we try to sort of then model different scenarios. And one specific element we want to show is that clearly in the model we can see that there are incentives for blocks to attract non-aligned region in their block. And so we simulate different scenarios, but again, the bottom line is that also the opposite block may sort of be willing to pay to avoid sort of losses from losing the non-aligned to the other region. In reality, these alignment choices are very complicated, but what we want to highlight is there are a lot of incentives to try to sort of bribe some regions and get them into the block. So to conclude, we basically show effect, widespread economic cost from strategic decoupling, about 2% of GDP, and this is an element that is a sort of a defense of global integration at a time in which several countries are instead advocating for inward-looking policies. In terms of policies, in a more fragmented world, I think that there is a lot of space for developing frameworks for international consultation to sort of reduce uncertainty on policy option. And from a country perspective, there are policies to promote and to sort of becoming more attractive and benefit from potential diversion of FDI. At the same time, there are also policies that can help to reduce vulnerability to FDI application. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor for open discussion now.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I have a question, maybe a half comment. The question is about the data. So FDI is numbers usually, right, of FDI. Do you confirm that these results are interesting, that you showed are robust when you try to use also the estimate dollars values?
Yes,
and
so yeah.
The half comment is finished. And the half comment is on the last part. It seems like a little bit of a naive Washington view, like to see the world in these blocks that move around. And so I was wondering whether in the model you could also consider the trade tensions, right? So you have FDI movement, but you also have a trade war going on. So that would be an element that should be probably taken into account.
Yeah, so on the first point, yes, I mean, we use count data simply because the dollar value are often estimated, so we don't trust them that much. That said, if you use those results, go through actually in the gravity, some of the results are even better, meaning we can have country per fixed effect and we still have good results. So, but again, I think I would trust more like count data compared to dollar values. On the modeling part, I didn't have the time to explain everything. Yes, in the baseline, we simply split the world into two, like the US block and the China block. We have sort of scenarios a little bit more complex, in which at least we'll have a tripolar world, in which sort of separate out the Europe from the US, for instance, and try to see what happens in that scenario. On the fact of like looking at trade, I think our point here was we try to get it as much as we can close to the idea of only sort of zooming in on one channel, which is FDI. The point is that for the way in which the model is built, we're going to capture something else, and we not only capture FDI. I agree with you that would be best to sort of to have a model which allows us to look at the complexity of different channels, and especially how they interact, because at least the thing that I've read, most of the literature look at sort of the effect of trade fragmentation. It's not clear then, how sort of you have trade fragmentation, you have capital flows, you have FDI, how all these channels interplay. It's not super clear. But so far, I haven't seen like something that is able to sort of put everything together.
Thank you.
Stuart?
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. A couple of sort of related points and questions. The first bit is, by nature, your data is limited, as I understand it, to greenfield flows of FDI. So for people who aren't FDI experts, that's just to put in context that that's a minority of overall FDI flows, which also have sort of brownfield and reinvestment. But also there's sort of bigger questions around sort of FDI shocks, in the event of a shock. So I wondered if you had any thoughts around what would happen to FDI stocks and other types of flows in the event of a shock. And the other sort of point I wanted to raise was, I think slide 8, you were talking about FDI to Western countries versus Asia and that shift. How do you sort of extract the differences or isolate the differences between, say, horizontal and vertical FDI versus the geopolitical nature of the shock? Because as trade restrictions and other sort of barriers go up, you'd expect there'd be incentives to have more horizontal FDI, which typically goes between similar income level countries, versus more constraints on vertical FDI to places like Asia.
No, thanks. It's a real good point. Like on the first one on Greenfield, yes, all the analysis that I've shown and presented is on Greenfield FDI. All the part, like I say, all the part on geopolitical tension, like the geopolitical distance and FDI flows, go through, we have like M&A's data, so if you do the same exercise on brownfield, we find very similar results. The downside is that, you know, we don't have data up to, we actually missed the last 2 or 3 years, so we don't show, but, you know, we are working on a sort of more academic paper in which we sort of put together brownfield and greenfield and the results go through. Like your second point is on divestment. I think that's a very important issue, meaning ideally what I would have loved to do is like having some measure of FDI stock and see what was happening and actually looking for evidence of divestment. The point is that, you know, as far as I know, there's no this kind of information yet. So in the descriptive part, like the sort of the reduction in the number of new investment is taken by us as a proxy of divestment, which is like clearly not ideal. In the model, at some point, we thought about looking at sort of, you know, because we can construct this stock of capital coming, you know, if you accumulate this FDI, we can have a stock of capital from different source countries, and then we can sort of simulate some sort of divestment shock on those capital stock. So that was one route we took at the very beginning, but then, you know, we went one other direction. Maybe it would be worthwhile to go back to that. On this horizontal versus vertical FDI instead, I haven't discussed that, but one of the pieces of evidence when we look at the spillover of FDI, so we have a part in the paper in which we look at sort of we revisit this literature on spillovers of FDI, and we exactly try to understand if at least the correlation that people generally show in sort of cross country is driven more by vertical versus horizontal FDI. So we can split the sample in countries which rely more on vertical FDI rather than horizontal FDI. We do in a couple of ways. One way, which is more precise, we look at only outward FDI from Korea, for which we have a lot of information. And then under the assumption that sort of the global FDI mimics the Korean sort of pattern, then we can split in another way. We look at Orbis data. We have a sort of better coverage, but we have a less precise measure. And then bottom line, we find that sort of at least the correlation between FDI and growth is driven by vertical FDI. And we use this kind of result as a way that if we think about, again, as you were saying, of reshoring and friendshoring, this kind of policies tend to target more sort of vertical FDI. So that's another argument for which we think that, you know, if you go in a fragmentation scenario, then we should have like output losses for host economies. Thank you.
I think it's a very interesting paper. Just 3 quick points. You know, one is when you look at the actual flows of FDI, especially into East Asia, you saw this big spike after about 2018, 2019, and then a significant decline. So how much of this is driven by, you know, bilateral COVID or, you know, or country-specific dimensions, and how much because of the trade thing? I think disentangling that is what I think induced Amit to stop his trade work in 2019. So the second point is that, you know, instead of thinking of this friendshoring and thing as a pure negative shock, which increases the average level of restrictions across the world, you know, maybe friendshoring offers some greater predictability or transparency, openness. So maybe one simulation would be to see average restrictions the same, but a reallocation towards friends. So you could then see the pure distortion arising from a misallocation rather than an increase in average restrictions. And the final point is that, you know, we did some work looking at the trade dimension. And, you know, I think some simulations done by your colleagues in the fund and the bank assume this partitioning of the world into trade blocks, but it's not, you know, it's not a subgame perfect equilibrium. You know, it's not, countries do not have an incentive to do that. So I think more realistically, there are situations where you see, you know, countries prefer to be hubs rather than join other countries in the isolation of being spokes. So I think thinking of what kind of blocks are likely to endogenously emerge when 2 big countries
fall apart, I think might be also interesting.
Again, like there are all three good points. Let me try to answer so on the first one, yes, you're right. We don't go too much into that, and the reason is very simple. Reason is that we simply look at some of the studies facts just to sort of show that there is some sort of regional clustering or regionalization of the flows, and then we take it as sort of a first step to say, okay, then maybe there is some elements of geopolitics behind those flows. Clearly, we're not saying that everything is driven by that, and there's a lot of other things going on, like general, global pattern like automation and regional country-specific pattern, like in the case of Asia, like I mentioned, zero COVID for China and other factors. But it's true that we could explain it a bit more. On the second point, on sort of thinking about friendshoring and the point of misallocation. So we're trying to get at that when you sort of look at what happens to sort of non-aligned countries. So the non-aligned regions sort of could, in theory, should benefit from investment diversion. So we can see that under certain parameterization of the model, actually those countries can benefit from new investment coming in, meaning American investment getting out of China and going to some country which is able to stay non-aligned. So we can show that, and that's sort of the closest we can get, I guess, this idea of sort of what could happen to some countries. And in terms of the trade bloc, again, I think we're trying to get into that when we see what happens to the non-aligned. So we use this non-aligned region, and that's, we have one in Asia and one in Latin America. And we try to, what the model tells us is that if countries are able to sort of walk this very fine line and being able to sort of stay in between, then they could actually benefit. The point is that staying so non-aligned, there is a lot of uncertainty, and clearly the model clearly show that there are incentive for one block to attract those countries in their block, but there is also incentive for the opposite block if you want to sort of avoid that non-aligned is going to fall in the other block. So there is, and then the interpretation of that is clearly there is a lot of uncertainty and situation and it sort of the world could partition. So I guess we don't go in what you're suggesting, which is sort of try to say something about endogenous block formation. I guess that's way more ambitious than what we started doing, but I agree that it's a very important point. I think we want simply highlight that there are these mechanisms and those tensions, which to some extent sort of speaks to what we see, what we've seen in the past and what we see every day on the news.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the next presenter.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present the paper. Pleasure to be here. Work I'm going to present joint work. Well, thank you very much again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. The work I'm going to present is joint work with Fernando Bronner, Tatiana Didier, who is also at the bank here in Malaysia, and Getz von Peter from the BIS. And it's work on bilateral international investments, and we are looking at the issue of how big is the South or emerging economies in these international financial positions. So there is no need to motivate this issue here in this conference, but there is a lot of interest on integration of the South into the world economy. And evident by the papers that have been presented here, there is a lot of interest on trade integration And in fact, there is a nice paper in 2012 in the Journal of Economic Perspective by Gordon Hanson on the rise of the Middle Kingdoms. On the financial side, there is also much discussion and not systematic evidence like the one that we are going to present in this paper. The previous paper by Andrea is evidence of the interest of the bilateral connections, but we are going to do this more systematically in this paper. There is a recent focus, of course, on China, and now also on the Gulf countries that they have been receiving a lot of revenues from oil exports and how they are investing those around the world. So what we do in this paper, we explore the financial integration of the South during the past 2 decades. And the South, I mean emerging markets and developing countries, and we compare them to the integration of the North. What we do that is systematic is that we look at these things over time, and we compare different type of investments. We look at bank loans and deposits, portfolio investments in debt and equity, FDI, and international reserves. So the advantage is that we are comparing all different type of investments over time on a kind of systematic basis. So the main results, just to summarize, the paper has many results. I will not have time to cover all of them, but let me point to the main results and show later some of those facts, but there are many other facts that we will not cover here. There has been a rapid growth of international investments involving the South. The South to South investments grew faster than North to South, South to North investments, which in turn grew faster than North to North investment. So the South has been growing at a faster pace, and this happens across investment types. South portfolio investments and international reserves grew faster than FDI, and the South FDI grew faster than bank loans and deposits. So there is an ordering of which pair of countries or regions have been growing faster and what type of investments have been growing faster. Across South regions, there is, despite the discussions on China, China is not an outlier. And if anything, Africa is the region with the faster growth in portfolio investment and FDI, and Eastern Europe is a region with the faster growth in bank loans and deposits. There is also a significant discussion in the literature of the role of offshore financial centers that are playing a major role in intermediating these financial transactions. And we argue that offshore financial centers do not play that of a major role. They are important, but they are not driving these trends. And the size of the offshore financial centers, when you compare the flows for different regions or the investments across different regions, are not that large in offshore.
Sergio, are these not the first set of bullets? Is that about source or destination? China is not an outlier as a.
So both as a source and destination. And we do the comparisons as source and destination, but I mean, some of them we take the average of source and destination.
And when you say Africa is the region with the fastest growth in portfolio investments, means as within Africa, source, destination?
I will go into that because we look at intra-regional and inter-regional. And the ones that have been growing the fastest are the inter-regional, not the intra-regional. But I will show you results for different regions. What are the vis-a-vis the North and vis-a-vis other regions of the South, intra-regional and inter-regional. Let me go. I mean, this is just a summary of the results, but as I said, there are many results in the paper, so different readers will get different things. But let me just summarize the main things so we don't get lost. But I will go into that in a second. The other thing that is important is we know that the South has been growing faster than the rest of the world. So these trends can be driven by just the fact that over the last 20 years, the South countries, especially, for example, China and Asia, has become much richer and can be capturing all those larger transactions that we observe. But that's not the case. The growth on the financial side has been higher than the growth on the real side. and especially after the global financial crisis. And we also decompose the role of the extensive and intensive margin. What we do find is that there is a big growth in the extensive margin in terms of many more connections have been formed among countries in the South. But this is not driving the big increase in the intensive margin. The big increase in the intensive margin were from the previous connections that grew a lot, and the extensive margin, the new connections that have been formed, capture a fraction of it. And I will go into those results later. So in terms of how that fits to the literature, there is a lot of analysis on gross stocks of our international investment positions. There are several papers on that. That takes the gross stocks of international investment positions for each country vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but not the bilateral ones. There are studies on bilateral investment that are typically focused on single investment types, like the one that Andrea presented today. They focus on FDI. There are many others that look at different aspects of different investment positions, but they don't compare across investment positions. So that's kind of our advantage, is that we can then look at this disaggregated data and compare all of those. In terms of which data we use the international investments as reported by residency, not nationality. North, we define North as according to the BIS annual report, which are the United States, Western Europe, Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and plus other jurisdictions. All the rest are the South. So that's kind of the definition that we adopt in the paper. We exclude offshore financial centers from most of the analysis, and offshore financial centers are defined by the IMF report. We look at, as I said, the 4 out of the 5 functional categories of balance of payment. We don't look at derivatives, but then we look at all the other components of the balance of payments. And the objective is to construct a bilateral version of the external Wealth of Nations database that is widely used by Lena Milesi-Ferretti. And we look at year-end nominal stocks that are transformed into constant dollars. So for the sources of our data, we use the BIS locations statistics that take 200 source countries to 210 destination countries. These confidential data that we use, but in the paper, we are posting the data at some aggregation level so people can use it. Country to region, region to country, region to region, we are making that data available. The portfolio investment is data that is already there, available to the public. It's the IMF, the CPIS data that has 92 source countries and 238 destination countries. As FDI, we don't use FDI markets as it was used in the previous paper. We use, because those are announcements, we look at the actual investment positions. We look at the UNCTAD data and the IMF data. The UNCTAD data is now available more recently. We got the data until 2008, but we also use the IMF data that is available since 2009, and we merge the two databases. If we do everything with the UNCTAD data up to now, we get similar results. And for international reserves, it's trickier because we don't have the investment of each country in each other country in the world. We have each country as reporting international reserves, and we look at the currency composition of the holdings for emerging economies, for the South and for the North. And for example, if countries are investing in US dollars, is investment into the North. But if they are investing in other currencies, that basically RMB, renminbi, those are investments of reserves in the South. That's how we compute the reserves. So the reserves results are, for comparison, they are not perfect, but I think it still gives us some nice description of the data and some nice comparisons. So as I was mentioning, if we compare our data, which is the solid lines, with this bilateral data, with the aggregate data, that is, for example, bank loans and deposits that each country reports vis-a-vis the rest of the world. This is not bilateral data. We get kind of similar numbers in the levels and in the trends. We have a lower numbers for bank loans or deposits because not all countries are reporting. So we might have some missing values there relative to when the report vis-a-vis all countries in the world. So the bilateral data has a little bit less coverage, but the pattern over time is similar. For portfolio, FDI, and international reserves, we get very similar numbers. So we can get the aggregate numbers from the disaggregated data, and now that we are sure that we can replicate the aggregate numbers, then we can take a look at the disaggregated data. So this is one of the typical tables that we look at the paper. So we compare bank loans and deposits, portfolios, FDI, and international reserves at the beginning of the sample, 2001, at the end of the sample, and around the global financial crisis, which is a big turning point. And we look at the source and destination north-north, north to the south, south to the north, and south to the south. So this is the aggregate data. Then we'll go country by country. But the aggregate data, what is very clear is that, for example, the north to north has been relatively stagnant. It started at 20% of world GDP, and it ended at 20% of world GDP. While the other ones have been growing, especially the south to south. They went from 1.6 to 3.6. So the number is much lower than the north to north, and it remains much lower, but the growth rate is significantly larger here. The same happened for portfolio investment. We see that north to north, it went from 26 to 40% of our GDP, and portfolio investment south to south went from almost 0.2% of world GDP to 1.6. It's still very small, but the growth rate is larger. The other thing that is notorious is that the numbers here, for example, in bank loans and deposits, portfolio investments, and FDI are similar. They are comparable. So we can also see how important the different type of investments are. And south to south, in both bank loan and deposits and portfolio investment, south to south has become important. Yeah.
What share of total investment flows are attributed to offshore financial centers?
I'll go later to the numbers because we can show exactly those numbers, but they are much smaller. I will show you. This is excluding offshore financial center. When we include offshore financial center, we will see the numbers. Some of them, in some cases, they capture something, but it's not driving. Yeah.
So international reserves, so countries holding USD reserves is considered not, so if a developing country has USD reserve, that's north to south.
Reserves? Reserves, yeah. So reserves, if the reserves is the investment from the south to the north, if the south country is holding a US, this is investment from the north to the south to the north.
Okay.
So on reserves, it's clear that the south is important. I mean, the holdings of international reserves is clearly seen here. I mean, the largest increase and the largest number of international reserves across regions is not north-north, is south holdings of reserves from the north.
Sorry, clarification on this, because you mentioned that you need to assume that every country has the same currency composition.
For
the reserve.
For reserves.
And
yes.
Which country is the base country?
So, well, the IMF reports for the north and for the south the currency composition of international reserves.
Okay.
So we say all countries in the north, all countries in the south hold the same
Okay,
composition.
because they have the data, but it's confidential, so they only report.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So we assume that there is no difference across countries in the south on which they're holding, but as an aggregate, we know that how much they are investing in the north versus the south. And we know the level of reserves of each country, and that's how we compute this. Okay, so this gives you some idea of the magnitudes. And the trends, if one looks at the same thing as in graphs, it's very clear. For example, portfolio investment, the dashed lines are the north-north. The north-north tends to be very stagnant, and we see growth in the south, especially in the south-south. We run these things at the country level, country region level, and region level. And we look at the trends, the value of the positions, and we look at the trends of the north-north, north-south, south-north, and south-south. And then we look at the differences. And we report these type of tables in which we put the region-to-region values, country-to-region values, country-to-country values using OLS or PPML, and the top 20% of the countries, the richest countries in terms of GDP, which report data more consistently. Here we have all the positions that are coming. So if a small country start reporting and there is issues with misreporting or thresholds, etc., we wanted to make sure that the countries are reporting more consistently, we get similar results. And basically, what one observes is that the trend that involves the south-south, they tend to be larger than the other trends. And we do tests between the south-south minus the north-north trend. We look at tests between the south destination minus the north destination trend, and the south source minus north source trends. And then we do all these tests. And in general, all the tests, what we find consistently across specifications and across our type of flows is that the south is growing at a faster rate. So that's portfolio, and that's for FDI. So we get very similar results, and also for international reserves. So going to the different type of regional differences that we see, arguing that China is not unique. We divide China, Asia excluding China, Africa, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Latin America, Middle East. And we calculate all these numbers with these partitions. And what we do observe is that this is, for example, bank loan deposits. This is the north-north estimate. And this is the north to south, south to north, and south-south estimate, using, instead of one south, several regions of the south. And we do tend to observe the south-south, then all the coefficients are larger than the north-north. The same thing for portfolio, the same thing for FDI. So the pattern is not driven by one region. Going to the other questions that came up is, we look at at the north with the north and north with the south. You see here, they will look at China, China with the north, China with the south, Asia with the north, Asia interregional and Asia intra-regional, Africa, Eastern Europe, etc. For bank loans and deposits, we see that the ones that is growing the fastest is Eastern Europe. In this case, it's the intra-regional. But for the others, we tend to see the point I was mentioning earlier, that the interregional is larger than the intra-regional. And Africa, in terms of portfolio investment, is the one that grew the fastest in both interregionally and intra-regionally. The same thing for FDI. Africa is the one that grew the fastest. And again, it's interregional investments that are becoming more important, not intra-regionally. Another issue that came up is also how big China is. If one looks at the 2018 numbers, of course, North is much larger than all the rest, but Asia, excluding China, is larger than China on all of the investment positions. This is bank loans and deposits. So China is not larger than Asia as a whole. If one looks at portfolio investment, again, Asia, excluding China, is larger than China. And FDI, Asia, excluding China, is larger than China.
Yeah, Hong
Kong is outside China. But we have separate number for Hong Kong. We can compare those. So this is going to the question of going to Aditya. So I'm sorry. So this is the previous block that we had before. And this is just showing offshore centers, north to offshore center to the north, south to offshore center to the south, and offshore centers to offshore centers. These are the numbers that you can compare the top block with the bottom block. The bottom block in some cases is significant. I'm not saying it's not significant, but the top block, which is excluding offshore financing centers, we see that the numbers are much larger. So it's not that all the intermediation is going through the offshore financial centers. And it doesn't change the trend. If we add the offshore financial centers to the north and the south, for example, if we add Belize or Panama to the south and add the Isle of Man to the north, and we recompute everything, we get very similar patterns. So they are not affecting our results. They are there, but they are not the drivers. So we look at the value of the connections relative to GDP. Let me show you some numbers. The numbers stand relative to GDP. Of course, they become smaller. So GDP explains part of this growth, but it doesn't explain everything. If one looks at the trends over time, these are not linear trends, but the coefficients over time. Relative to GDP, is very clear that for bank loans and deposits, up to the global financial crisis, the north-north and the south-south, for example, grew at the same rate. And then there was a kind of decoupling. The south-south grew faster than the north-north. Portfolio investment, all the ones related to the south grew faster throughout. And FDI, after the global financial crisis, the ones for the south grew faster than the ones for the north-north. The extensive margin, as I was saying, many more connections were formed. If one looks, for example, at the map of the connections in 2001 and the map of the connection in 2018, there are many more connections in 2018. So connections all over the world. Then we compare the connections the number of connections that were happening in the south-south versus north-south, south-north, and north-north. And in general, south-south was growing. They were establishing many more connections than the others in both bank loans, portfolio investment, and FDI. And this is the last point I wanted to mention. If one looks at the value of the connections in 2018, how much was explained by the old links and how much was explained by new links, all these new links that were formed explain a relatively small part of the total value of the investments in 2018. In foreign direct investment, which is the largest number that we get, is 20%. New links that were established explain 20% of the investment in 2008, 25%, and the rest was explained by old links. So old links are still accounting for most of the transactions. So to conclude, we observe a rapid growth of international investments involved in the South. We expect much more growth to come because the level for the South are still low, even though they have been growing fast. The extensive margin, also that all these connections that were formed can generate growth in the intensive margin in the years to come. And South countries are also growing richer. The fact that South countries are growing richer, for example, the case I was mentioning earlier about the Gulf countries receiving a lot of revenue from oil exports, they are recirculating that investment into investment in other regions of the world. Before they were invested a lot in US treasuries. Now they are investing in other countries in the Middle East, Asia, etc. That's at least what the anecdotal evidence suggests. But that's it for the paper, and thank you very much.
Hey, Sergio, really intuitive conclusion. Thank you very much. I have a question. I have two questions, actually. One is, I wonder if you could go over a bit more in terms of how you treat regional and global financial sensors. Specifically, when I think about this, if this is locational data that you're looking at, so flows into places like Hong Kong or Luxembourg might not necessarily have a final destination into Hong Kong or Luxembourg. It might be through Hong Kong to elsewhere, out of China, into Japan, and vice versa. So that's one. How do you guys treat that? And the second thing is, second question is, do you mind just going over the intuition behind the rise in the number of linkages in 2018? It seems to be quite dramatic. So what's behind that? You know, I get that as countries get richer, these flows increase, but there's something seems to be unique about the period of 2018. So if you could just go over that, that'd be great.
Well, I mean, the issue of Hong Kong, I know it's important. We didn't want to take a stand on it. So we did is that we took the IMF, what the IMF called the offshore financial center, and we stuck to that definition of offshore financial center. And this is the list of offshore financial centers, Turks and Caicos, that's there, but these are the other ones that are listed by the IMF. I mean, it's true that the ones from Asia, for example, Hong Kong into China might be important. I'm not saying it's not important, it is important, but one looks, for example, at the inter-regional investments in China are even sometimes more important than the intra-regional investments. So to the extent that these patterns are driven by, Hong Kong investment into China, etc., we wouldn't find anything on inter-regional investments, and we find that the inter-regional is really important. So it's not driven by those type of investments that one has in mind. Regarding the growth of the extensive margin, we picked 2018 as an illustration, but we observe it over time that the number of connections have been growing, and they have been growing. It's just, you see the proliferation of investments, portfolio investment, FDI, banking, Brazilian banks making loans in the region or outside, Chinese banks making loans everywhere, and the same thing for FDI, same thing for portfolio investment. So you tend to see that in the data. It's just that they are diversifying more. It seems that before, it was more kind of the north to north, and it was more, for example, south investments of people reaching Latin America, putting the money in Miami, or petrodollars in New York, etc. Now the petrodollars are going other places. Money is not going just to the US, it's going to other places from the south, etc. So you see much more diversification, and that's what we observe. Still, in terms of the quantitative number is there, but it's not driving all the results, but there are many more investments than before. That's what the data says.
Sergio, one is this phenomenon of, uphill flow of capital from poor countries to rich countries. And the other is where this is illusory because a lot of intermediation happens in rich countries. And so over time, whether it's through deposits or through investment or through reserves, you said we are seeing diversification. But over time, the south-north flows, overall capital, are they still high? And how much, if you're only looking at the immediate source and the immediate location, can we really tell whether this is just initial intermediation or the final destination?
We don't know. We know that, there are investment from country X to country Y. We don't know, country X is holding that investment there. Whether that money then goes to somewhere else, we don't know. That's impossible. We just see the bank loan from China to an African country or to a Latin American country, or a Brazilian bank to any other country, or an FDI or a portfolio investment. That we know that is there on the books, but we don't know whether that money then goes somewhere else. We don't. That's impossible to know.
What about this? In FDI, you can look at ultimate beneficial owner rather than just the location from where it originated.
Well, we know what the location is, where it's originated and the destination. We know the source and the destination as reported.
But the idea of looking at who ultimately is the owner, like supposing there is
you know, that it comes from Hong Kong, but are you able to see who the ultimate beneficial owner, like in companies, you have this?
No, what we see from Hong Kong, we see the Hong Kong investments into other countries in the world. We see it.
So-
Whether the owner of the money is from, yeah.
On this point, I think there's some careful work being done by Matteo Maggioro and Jesse Schrager, one of my former colleagues, doing exactly this tracing of the bond issuances to the ultimate owner. And you may want to supplement it. They've posted all their data on their capital allocation website.
Yeah.
And it's designed exactly to disintermediate the issuances of bonds. To get exactly at this question.
Yeah, the question is whether you can do it. In that case, we can do more careful work for bonds. The question is then you start comparing how you compare that with FDI or equity investments or bank loans. I mean,
yeah, so you can't do it for everything. But
well, I mean, no, it's true that I mean for everything we can do much more. That's we wanted to get some simple benchmark. If we look at standard definition of investment for country A to country B, what do we get and how it compares across different type of investments? And that's what we get in this paper. But yes, more could be done to look at those issues. Ultimate owners, I mean, all those things are important and there are people doing work on that.
I have two comments.
Yep.
One is on Jesse's work. We looked into that. It's really useful. It's really good. I think it works.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I like it a lot.
It works for large issuers. So US, UK, you know, that have a sizable Chinese firms that have sizable presence in terms of international capital market. So for some of the smaller economies, doesn't make much of a difference. But I think it's useful. The second, back to Aditya's point in terms of FDI, I think there is a sort of a back of the envelope way that you can account for the possibility of FDI round tripping. So, you know, a company invest or in say, you know, some into Hong Kong, and then that money gets turned around and invests back onshore. Some of that's happening in certainly with Chinese companies for tax reasons, for various preferential treatments. So what we do, this is not peer reviewed, but one of the back of the envelope way you can do this is basically account for the different, to take into consideration the difference in terms of what's the outflow from one region A to B, and then from B to A. Just one way to us a robustness check.
Yes, I agree, but I mean, but you can also look at the things. How much is intra-regional versus inter-regional in Asia? And we can, from this data, if it is round tripping, you would observe it because you can see Hong Kong to China, China, Hong Kong. That we observe. And we know how big is Hong Kong relative to others. So if everything is round tripping, like Hong Kong to China, that type of story, that I mean, I believe it, that some of it is going on, but we are saying it's not the bulk of the numbers because we are observing a lot of, for example, inter-regional investments. So I mean, I think that in all these investment articles, press articles, etc. I mean, there is a lot of talk, but there is not much evidence. And what we're trying to provide is evidence of how big the numbers are. And we are not saying that those stories are not true, but we are putting some magnitude of how big they could be and then how big the other things are and then comparing them. And that's kind of what we're trying to say. That, I mean, there is a lot of talk about offshore financial centers. You look at them, you compare, they are large, but they are not driving the results. And so that's what I'm trying to document what is going on or what the data tells.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
We'll have a break for lunch, but I've been suggesting that we can also take a picture with all the participants, also presenters and participants. So can we gather in the middle of the room here, and then we'll go out for lunch.
Testing mic. Everyone, please come to the middle. Take a picture. Okay, to the middle, guys. Shafiq. Everyone, please come to the middle. Middle right here. Closer, closer. Middle.
Can everyone move here a bit? Yeah, come move here a bit. All right, it's good. Okay, thank you. Balance. Okay, that's it. Yeah. All right, good. That's it. That's good. Yeah, yes, good. All right. Come a bit. Can't see you. Come on, just come right side. Good. Okay, that's it. Come closer a bit. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's good. All right, good. Come closer. Thế này, maybe this side.
This side.
Yeah. All right, good.
Squeezing the TV 3 more steps. Squeezing. Yes.
Yes. Can't see, yeah. Lady, come forward. Yes, good. Come. Okay, and come closer. Okay, sir. Right, good. One ready. Right, good. Swim. Come on, so serious. Come on. Yes, please get one sweat. Nice. Okay, nice. And right, you can please start. One more. Last one. Yes, good, guys. All right. Thank you. Bye.
So we're back at 1:30 for the next session.
you.